The fog did not lift so much as it was torn apart. As though the violence below had become too great for even the heavens to conceal, the white curtain began to shred in long, ragged strips, pulled apart by a wind that came from nowhere and everywhere at once, a wind that smelled of blood and iron and the acrid tang of horses pushed beyond their limits. And as the fog retreated, the truth of what had happened in those blind, desperate minutes was laid bare for every man on every ridge to see. The valley floor was chaos. Not the ordered chaos of a planned engagement, but the raw, howling, primordial chaos of men and animals, locked together in a struggle that had abandoned all pretense of strategy and become something older, something more terrible, something that existed before the first army was formed, and would exist long after the last empire fell. Tarhan was in the center of it. Of course he was. Where else would Tarhan be? He fought from horseback with a sword in his right hand and the reins in his left, and his horse moved beneath him as though it were an extension of his body, turning and lunging and retreating with an instinct that no training could fully explain. Around him, the cavalry had fragmented into clusters of 2 and 3, small islands of resistance in a sea of enemy soldiers, each cluster fighting its own private war, connected to the larger battle only by the shared determination not to die. Evanos was 40 paces to Tarhan's left. He had lost his horse. The animal had been cut from beneath him in the first collision, a spear taking it through the chest, and Evanos had hit the ground rolling and come up with his sword already moving, already seeking the throat of the man who had killed his mount. He found it. The man fell. Evanos stepped over him and kept fighting on foot now, his movements tighter, more controlled, more desperate, because a man on foot in a cavalry engagement is a man who must make every stroke count or be trampled. And the enemy was everywhere. They had come through the eastern mouth of the Narrows in a column that stretched back beyond the limits of sight, and in the fog they had not seen Tarhan's cavalry until it was upon them, and the collision had been exactly what Tarhan had predicted, not a charge but a crash, 2 bodies of men and horses slamming into each other like waves meeting a cliff, and the result had been a maelstrom of steel and flesh from which no man could escape unscathed. But now the fog was lifting, now Damir Khan could see. And what Damir Khan saw made his blood turn cold and then immediately hot, because what he saw was that the enemy outnumbered Tarhan's cavalry by at least 3 to 1, perhaps 4, and the column was still coming, still pouring through the eastern mouth of the Narrows like water through a breach in a dam, and if it was not stopped, if the flow was not cut, then Tarhan and Evanos and every man in the valley would be drowned in a flood of enemy soldiers. Damir Khan did not hesitate. He did not wait for Tarhan's signal, because Tarhan was fighting for his life and could not give signals, and Damir Khan understood, with the intuition of a seasoned commander, that the moment for signals had passed, and the moment for action had arrived. He stood, he drew his sword. He turned to the 200 men crouched behind him on the left ridge, and he said one word that carried more weight than any speech, any prayer, any oath. He said, "Now." And 200 archers rose from behind the tree line like ghosts rising from the earth, and they drew their bows in a single synchronized motion, and for one frozen heartbeat, the world was still, perfectly still, the kind of stillness that exists between the lightning and the thunder. Then they fired. 200 arrows descended into the valley like the judgment of God. They came from above, from an angle that no shield could fully block, from a direction that the enemy had not expected, and they struck with the terrible, indiscriminate efficiency of a weapon that does not care who it kills or why. Men who were fighting became men who were falling. Men who were advancing became men who were dying. The column that had been pouring through the eastern mouth of the Narrows stumbled, staggered, and for one crucial moment, stopped. On the right ridge, Mahmud heard the volley and understood. He rose, his 150 archers rose with him. They had the higher ground, as Tarhan had said, and their arrows carried farther and struck harder. Mahmud did not need to give a command. His men had been watching the fog lift. They had been counting the seconds. They had been waiting with the patience of hunters who know that patience is the difference between eating and starving. They fired. The second volley struck the enemy from the opposite direction, a crossfire that turned the Narrows into a killing ground. Arrows flew from left and right, converging in the center of the valley where the enemy column was thickest, and the column began to collapse in upon itself, men pushing forward being struck from the left, men trying to retreat being struck from the right, officers screaming orders that no one could hear over the screaming of the wounded. Tarhan saw the volleys. He saw the enemy waver, and in that moment, that razor-thin moment between the enemy's confusion and their recovery, he did what Tarhan always did. He attacked. He spurred his horse forward, not away from the enemy, into them, directly into the thickest part of their formation, where the bodies were pressed so tightly together that men could barely swing their swords, where the horses were stumbling over the fallen, where the air was thick with dust and blood and the metallic taste of fear. He cut his way through. His sword moved with a fluidity that seemed impossible for a weapon of steel, as though it were made of something lighter, something animated by a force beyond mere muscle and bone. Each stroke was economical. Each stroke was final. He did not waste movement. He did not waste energy. He killed the way a surgeon cuts, with precision, with purpose, with the understanding that every unnecessary motion is a motion that could get him killed. Evanos saw Turhan's charge and felt something surge through him, a current of energy that overrode the burning in his lungs and the ache in his sword arm, and the fear that had been crouching in the back of his mind like a beast waiting to spring. He gathered 5 men, 5 cavalry soldiers who had been dismounted like himself, and he formed them into a wedge, a small, sharp, lethal wedge, and he drove that wedge into the enemy's left flank with a violence that surprised even him. The fighting that followed was the kind of fighting that no chronicle can adequately capture, because chronicles deal in movements and positions and tactical decisions, and this was beyond tactics. This was primal. This was the ancient, blood-soaked business of killing, or being killed at a distance measured in inches, where the difference between life and death was a half step to the left or a fraction of a second's faster reflexes, or simply the blind, random, heartless luck that determines which man the arrow finds and which man it passes by. Selim bin Yusuf, the 17-year-old who had confessed his fear to Evanos the night before, fought with a fury that belied his youth. He had been terrified in the fog, so terrified that his hands had shaken and his teeth had chattered, and he had been certain, absolutely certain, that he would disgrace himself. But when the first enemy soldier had loomed out of the white, nothing with a sword raised and a scream tearing from his throat, something in Selim had snapped, not broken but snapped into place, like a mechanism engaging, like a key turning in a lock, and the training that Tamia Boga had drilled into him over those brutal weeks took over, and his body moved before his mind could object. He blocked the first blow. He turned the second. He found the gap between the enemy's arm and his body and drove his sword into it, and the man fell, and Selim stood over him, breathing hard, covered in blood that was not his own, and felt not triumph but a terrible, holy clarity, the clarity of a man who has discovered that he is capable of things he never imagined and who does not know whether to be grateful or horrified. He fought on because there was no other option, because the men beside him were fighting, and to stop would be to betray them, and betrayal was the one sin that Selim bin Yusuf would never commit. The battle at Kara Dera lasted 4 hours, 4 hours that felt like 40 days, 4 hours in which the valley became a landscape of the dead, in which the shallow stream turned from silver to red, in which the boulders that had once been landmarks became obstacles that men tripped over and fell behind and used for cover and died upon. The enemy had come in greater numbers than anyone had anticipated, not the raiding party that the optimists had hoped for, not the moderate force that the realists had expected. A full army, 2,000 men, perhaps more, armored and provisioned, and led by a commander who knew his business and had studied the terrain and had planned meticulously, to push through the narrows and emerge on the other side with enough force to threaten Bursa directly. What that commander had not planned for was Turhan. What that commander had not planned for was 2 ridges full of archers who fired and fired and fired until their quivers were empty, and then picked up the swords of fallen men, and charged down the slopes into the enemy's flanks with the particular recklessness of men who have run out of arrows and patience simultaneously. What that commander had not planned for was 500 men who fought as though each one of them was individually responsible for the survival of their civilization, which, in a sense, they were. The enemy commander tried to organize a withdrawal. 3 times he sent officers to the rear of his column with orders to reform and retreat. 3 times those officers were intercepted. The first by Mahmud's archers, who had descended from the right ridge and positioned themselves at the eastern mouth of the narrows, effectively closing the door through which the enemy had entered. The second by a group of Turhan's dismounted cavalrymen who had worked their way along the valley wall and established a blocking position among the boulders. The third by Evanos himself, who appeared out of the smoke and dust like a phantom and struck the officer from his horse with a single blow that the men who witnessed it would describe for years afterward, with the reverence usually reserved for acts of divine intervention. By the 3rd hour, the enemy knew they were trapped. By the 4th hour, they knew they were defeated. The column that had entered the narrows as an army emerged from the other side as fragments, scattered groups of exhausted, wounded, demoralized men who stumbled through the western mouth of the valley and ran, simply ran, dropping their weapons and their standards and their pride on the blood-soaked ground behind them. Turhan did not pursue. He wanted to. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to chase the broken enemy and finish them, to ride them down and destroy them so completely that no one would ever again attempt what they had attempted. But he was a disciplined commander, and discipline told him that his men were exhausted, and his horses were blown, and his ammunition was spent, and that pursuit into unknown territory against an enemy that might have reserves waiting beyond the next ridgeline was a risk that no responsible leader could take. He called the halt. He sat on his horse in the center of the valley, surrounded by the dead and the dying, his sword resting across his saddle, his armor dented and scored and smeared with blood that belonged to so many different men that it would have been impossible to determine whose was whose. He looked at Evenos, who stood nearby, leaning on his sword, breathing like a man who has just run a distance that his body was never designed to cover. He said, "Evenos." Evenos looked up. His face was a mask of dirt and blood and exhaustion. He said, "Yes." Turhan said, 2 days. The Sultan asked for 2 days. We have given him 1. We hold tonight. We hold tomorrow. Then we have met our obligation. Evenos nodded. He said, "We hold." Turhan said, "Count the dead. Count the wounded. Redistribute the weapons. Move the enemy dead to the eastern mouth and stack them as a barricade. If they come again, they will have to climb over the bodies of their own brothers to reach us." It was a grim order. It was a necessary order. War does not permit the luxury of sentiment, not during the battle, not in its immediate aftermath. There would be time for mourning later. There would be time for prayers over the fallen. There would be time for washing the bodies and wrapping them in white and laying them in the earth-facing Mecca. But that time was not now. Now was the time for preparation, because the enemy had been broken but not destroyed, and a broken enemy is sometimes more dangerous than a whole one, because it has nothing left to lose. The count was brutal. Of the 500 who had ridden out of Bursa, 73 were dead. Another 41 were wounded badly enough that they could not fight again. 27 horses had been lost. Arrows were almost entirely expended. Swords were notched and dulled, and in some cases broken. Against this, the enemy had lost an estimated 400 dead and an unknown number of wounded. Scores of weapons and pieces of armor had been captured. 3 enemy officers had been taken prisoner, including one who appeared to be of significant rank based on the quality of his armor and the elaborate design of his sword. Turhan had the 3 officers brought before him. He looked at them. They were frightened. 2 of them could not meet his eyes. The third, the one with the elaborate sword, stared back at him with the defiant pride of a man who knows he is beaten but refuses to admit it. Turhan addressed this one. He said, "Who sent you?" The officer said nothing. Turhan said, "I will ask you once more. After that, I will not ask again. I will hand you to Mahmud, who has methods of extracting information that I do not approve of, but that I will not prevent when the lives of my men depend on the answers you carry. Who sent you?" The officer looked at Mahmud. Mahmud stood at the edge of the firelight with an expression that promised nothing pleasant. The officer looked back at Turhan. He swallowed. Then he said, "Shahanshah." Turhan nodded. He said, "How many more are coming?" The officer was quiet. Then he said, "This was the main force. There is no second army. Shahanshah committed everything to this thrust. He believed the narrows would be undefended. He believed you would be chasing shadows in the north while he pushed through the center." Turhan studied the man's face. He searched for lies and found, to his surprise, what appeared to be truth. He said, "And Burhan Faladios, where is he?" The officer's expression changed. A flicker of something crossed his face. Fear, perhaps, or recognition. He said, "Faladios is not with us. Faladios was sent on a different mission." Turhan leaned forward. He said, "What mission?" The officer said, "I do not know. I was told only that Faladios has his own objectives, and that our assault on the Narrows was intended to draw your main force east, while Faladios operated in the west." The words hit Turhan like a fist to the chest. The west. If Faladios was moving in the west, then the fortress repairs that Nasser had been worried about, the crumbling walls, the undermanned garrisons, the gaps in the defense that Carlil's labor solution had only partially addressed, all of these suddenly transformed from administrative inconveniences into potentially fatal vulnerabilities. Turhan stood. He said, "Evenos." Evenos was already moving. He had heard. He said, "Faladios. He is going for the western outposts. He is going to hit us where we are weakest while our strength is here." Turhan said, "Send a rider. The fastest man we have on the fastest horse we have. He rides for Bursa tonight. He tells the Sultan everything. Shahanshah's main army is broken at Kara Dera, but Faladios is in the west. The Sultan must redirect Altadin Saheb's forces immediately. Every hour of delay is an hour that Faladios uses to tear apart our western flank." Evenos said, "I will go myself." Turhan looked at him. He said, "You are wounded." Evenos looked down at himself. He had not noticed the cut along his left forearm, a shallow gash that had soaked his sleeve with blood but had not reached the muscle. He had not noticed the bruise on his ribs where a mace had glanced off his armor. He had not noticed any of it. because the body's capacity to ignore pain during battle is one of its most remarkable and most treacherous abilities. Remarkable because it allows a man to fight on when logic says he should fall. Treacherous because the pain that is ignored during the fight returns afterward with interest. He said, "It is nothing, a scratch, I can ride." Tarhan said, "It is not nothing, but it is not enough to stop you. Go, ride as though the future of everything we have built depends on your speed, because it does." Evanos turned to find a horse, then he stopped. He turned back, he said, "Tarhan." Tarhan said, "What?" Evanos said, "Selim bin Yusuf, the young one, he fought well today." Tarhan said, "I know, I saw, he will be rewarded." Evanos nodded. Then he found a horse, one of the captured enemy mounts, a big grey animal that was still breathing hard from the battle but had good legs and clear eyes and the look of a creature that could run if asked. He mounted, he pointed the horse west, and he rode. He rode through the night. He rode through terrain that would have been difficult in daylight and was murderous in darkness. He rode with his wounded arm pressed against his side, and his good hand on the reins and his eyes fixed on the path ahead, and his mind fixed on one thought, one single, burning, all-consuming thought. Faladios is coming. The grey horse beneath him ran as though it understood the stakes. Perhaps it did. Horses are sensitive animals, attuned to the emotions of their riders in ways that science has never fully explained, and the emotion that Evanos was radiating, that toxic mixture of urgency and fear and determination, was enough to drive any horse to its limits. He passed through villages that were dark and sleeping. He passed through forests where the trees pressed close and the undergrowth clawed at his legs. He forded a river at a crossing that was shallow enough to wade but deep enough to soak him to the waist, and the cold water hit his wounded arm like a slap and he gasped but did not slow. He climbed a ridge and descended the other side at a speed that would have killed a lesser rider or a lesser horse, and at the bottom he found the road that led to Bursa and he followed it, and the grey horse stretched its legs and ran, truly ran, with the ground-devouring stride of an animal born for exactly this purpose. Dawn found him still riding. The sun rose behind him, turning his shadow into a long, dark lance that pointed toward Bursa like a finger. The city appeared on the horizon, first as a smudge, then as a shape, then as a recognizable collection of walls and minarets and rooftops, and Evanos felt something release in his chest, not relief, not yet, but the knowledge that the message would be delivered, that the warning would be heard, that whatever happened next, it would not happen because of a failure to act. He reached the city gates just as the morning prayer was ending. The guards saw him coming, a lone rider on a grey horse, covered in blood and dust, riding at a speed that suggested either pursuit or insanity, and they opened the gate without waiting for identification, because the urgency of a man's riding is its own credential. Evanos rode through the streets without slowing. People jumped aside. A cart loaded with vegetables was narrowly avoided. A dog barked and then thought better of it. He rode directly to the palace, dismounted before the horse had stopped, stumbled because his legs had been gripping the saddle for so long that they had temporarily forgotten how to support his weight on solid ground, recovered, and ran. He ran through the palace corridors. He ran past guards who tried to stop him, and servants who tried to ask him what was wrong and ayahs who tried to announce him formally. He ran until he reached the council chamber, and he burst through the door, and Arhan Sahib was there, standing at the map table, and Malhan Khartoum was there, and Kala was there, and Nasser Celebi was there, and they all turned to look at him, and what they saw was a man who had ridden through the night from a battlefield, wounded and exhausted and driven by a message that could not wait. Evanos stood in the doorway. He was breathing so hard that his first attempt at speech produced no words, only a ragged exhalation that sounded like the last gasp of a dying wind. He tried again. He said, "My Sultan." Arhan stepped toward him. His face was calm, but his eyes were intense. He said, "Evanos, speak." Evanos said, "Kara Dera is held. Tarhan holds the Narrows. Shahanshah's main force is broken. 400 enemy dead, 73 of ours. Tarhan can hold for another day, perhaps two." Arhan said, "Alhamdulillah, praise be to Allah, but something else brought you here at this speed, something more, tell me." Evanos said, "Faladios. Burhan Faladios is not with Shahanshah's army. He was never with Shahanshah's army. The assault on Kara Dera was a diversion. While we were fighting in the east, Faladios was sent west. The prisoner said Faladios has his own objectives. The western outposts, my Sultan, the ones with the crumbling walls, the ones that Nasser was trying to repair. Faladios is heading for them if he has not reached them already." The room changed. The temperature did not drop, but it felt as though it had. Every person in the room understood in the same instant, with the same sickening clarity, what Evanos was saying. Kara Dera had been a feint, not the main attack but a distraction, a way to draw Turhan and 500 men eastward while the real blow fell in the west, where the defenses were weakest and the garrisons were thinnest, and the walls had gaps that a determined enemy could exploit. Shahanshah, that serpent, that master of misdirection, he had played them. He had sacrificed 2,000 men as bait, throwing them against the narrows knowing that they would be defeated, knowing that their defeat would make Orhan believe the threat had been neutralized, knowing that by the time the truth was discovered, Faladios would be through the western defenses and into the heartland. Orhan's hands tightened on the edge of the map table, his knuckles whitened. For a moment, just a moment, something dark and furious crossed his face, the face of a man who has been deceived by an enemy he had underestimated, and the fury was not just at Shahanshah but at himself, at his own failure to see the trap, at his own willingness to believe that Kara Dera was the main effort when every instinct should have told him that Shahanshah never made a direct attack when a flanking maneuver was possible. Then the moment passed, the fury was controlled, compartmentalized, filed away for later use, because a sultan who acts from fury is a sultan who makes mistakes, and mistakes now would cost lives that could not be replaced. Orhan said, "Nasa, where is Altadin Saheb?" Nasa consulted his notes. He said, Altadin Saheb received the order to march for Bursa 2 days ago. Based on his last known position, he should be 1 day's march north of the city. His force consists of 300 infantry and 100 cavalry. Orhan said, send a rider to intercept him. New orders. He does not come to Bursa. He turns west immediately. He marches for the western outposts at maximum speed. He is to engage and delay Faladios until I can bring reinforcements. Nasa said, my sultan, Altadin's force is not large enough to engage Faladios directly. We do not even know how many men Faladios has. Orhan said, I know. That is why I said delay, not defeat. Altadin is a veteran. He understands the difference. He will use the terrain. He will use hit-and-run tactics. He will make Faladios fight for every mile and pay for every step. And while Faladios is paying, I will be gathering every available man and moving west to finish what Altadin starts. Khalil said, my sultan, if you take the remaining garrison west, the city will be virtually undefended. Orhan looked at him. He said the city will be defended by the Bajian, by the recruits that Tamia Boga has trained, by the women who can wield a bow, by every man and woman in Bursa who has the will to fight. Khalil, I am not leaving the city undefended. I am trusting its defense to the people who live in it. He turned to Malhun Khatun. She met his gaze steadily. He said, can you hold the city? She said, I can hold the city. He said, if Faladios sends a secondary force toward Bursa, while his main body attacks the western outposts, can you hold the walls until I return? She said, I will hold the walls. I will hold them with the Bajian and the recruits and the old men and the boys and the women with kitchen knives if I have to. I will hold them because they are my walls. This is my city. These are my people, and I will not surrender them to anyone. Orhan looked at her, and what passed between them in that look was something that no words could capture because it was not a conversation. It was a communion. The silent, profound, unbreakable understanding between two people who have shared a life and are now sharing a crisis, and who trust each other not because trust is easy but because there is no alternative, and because the alternative to trust is despair, and despair is a luxury that neither of them has ever been able to afford. He said, I know you will. Then he turned back to the room. He said, Evanos, you have ridden through the night, you are wounded, you need rest. Evanos said, I do not need rest, my sultan. I need a fresh horse and a full quiver. I ride west with you. Orhan studied him, the blood-soaked sleeve, the bruised ribs, the eyes that were red-rimmed and sunken and burning with a fire that physical exhaustion could not extinguish. He said, your wound. Evanos said, is a scratch. I have had worse from Fatima Khatun's tongue. Something shifted in the room, not quite laughter, not in a moment like this, but something, a lightening, a breath, the acknowledgement that even in the darkest hour, the human spirit insists on asserting itself, on finding moments of levity in the wasteland of crisis. Orhan said, very well, you ride with me, but you eat first, and you let the physician bind that wound properly. I will not lose a man to infection who survived a battle. Evanos bowed. He said, as you command, my sultan. And the machinery of war began to turn again. Riders were dispatched, orders were issued, horses were saddled, weapons were sharpened, provisions were loaded. The city that had barely begun to breathe after the departure of Turhan's force was now preparing for a second departure, a second emptying, a second act of faith in which the sultan would take everything he had and ride toward an enemy whose strength and position were unknown. Fatima found Evanos in the physician's quarters. He was sitting on a bench while an old man with gentle hands cleaned and bound the wound on his forearm. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment, just a moment, all the urgency and the fear and the weight of the crisis fell away, and he was simply a man looking at the woman he loved. She stood in the doorway. She did not rush to him. She did not weep. She did not demand to know if he was all right. She looked at the wound on his arm. She looked at the blood on his clothes. She looked at his face, which was grey with exhaustion and dark with battle grime, and she said, "You are alive." He said, "I am alive." She said, "And Tarhan?" He said, "Tarhan holds, he fights, he is Tarhan." She nodded, then she stepped closer. She reached into the folds of her garment and produced a small cloth bundle. She placed it on the bench beside him. She said, "Dried fruit and bread, you have not eaten. I can tell because your hands are shaking, and your hands do not shake from fear." He looked at the bundle, he looked at her. He said, "Fatima." She said, "Eat, then ride, come back alive. We have unfinished business, you and I." He said, "The proposal." She said, "Among other things." She turned to leave. At the doorway she paused. Without turning back, she said, "Ever knows. When you asked me how many men had sought my hand, you wanted a number. Here is your number. None of them mattered. None of them were you. That is the only number that counts." Then she was gone. And Evernos sat on the bench with his wound, half-bound and the bread untouched, and something in his chest that was too large for his ribs to contain. A feeling that was not joy and not sorrow, and not hope and not fear, but all of these things woven together into something that had no name. Something that only exists in the space between a man who loves and a woman who loves him back, and the war that stands between them like a wall of fire that must be walked through before they can reach each other. He ate the bread, he ate the dried fruit. He let the physician finish binding his wound. And then he stood and walked to the stables and found a fresh horse and saddled it, and rode out through the gates of Bursa at the head of a column of 260 soldiers, riding beside Orhan Saheb, riding west, riding toward Burhan Faladios, and whatever awaited them at the crumbling western outposts. And behind them the gates closed. And Malhun Khatun stood on the walls and watched them go, exactly as she had watched Turhan go, exactly as she had watched her husband ride away from her 100 times before. And each time she had stood on these walls and watched and said nothing and shown nothing, and kept the storm inside herself locked behind a door that no one was permitted to open, because if she opened it, if she allowed even a single tear to fall in a place where anyone could see, then the women behind her would weaken, and the servants would panic, and the children would cry, and the entire edifice of strength that she had built and maintained through sheer force of will would collapse. She did not open the door, she never opened the door. She stood on the walls, and she was stone and she was iron, and she was the last line of defense, not just against the enemy without but against the fear within. Fatima joined her on the wall. They stood side by side, neither spoke. They watched the column disappear into the western distance, the dust of its passage hanging in the air like a curtain slowly falling. Then Fatima said, "He will come back." Malhun said, "They will both come back." Fatima said, "Yes." And they stood there in the silence, two women on a wall, watching the dust settle, holding the city together with their presence, holding themselves together with their faith, holding each other together with the wordless solidarity of women who understand that strength is not the absence of fear, but the decision to stand despite it. And in the west, beyond the hills and the valleys and the rivers that the column would have to cross, Burhan Faladios was moving. He was moving with the cold, methodical efficiency of a man who has been given a mission and intends to complete it regardless of the cost. He had 600 men, not a large force, but large enough for what he intended, which was not conquest but destruction. He did not want to hold the western outposts, he wanted to burn them. He wanted to tear down the walls and poison the wells and salt the earth, and leave behind a landscape of devastation that would take years to repair. This was Shahanshah's strategy, not the crude arithmetic of territory gained and territory lost, but the subtler, more devastating calculus of infrastructure destroyed and morale broken. An empire that loses a battle recovers in weeks. An empire that loses its infrastructure recovers in years. And an empire whose people lose faith in the ability of their sultan to protect them may never recover at all. Faladios understood this. He had argued with Shahanshah about the tactics. He had wanted to lead the main assault on Karadera himself, to meet Turhan in the field and settle the matter with steel. But Shahanshah had overruled him. Shahanshah had said, "The narrows are a trap. Whoever enters them will be caught. I will send the expendable ones through the narrows. You will go west, where the walls are weak and the garrisons are thin, and you will do what you do best. You will break things." Faladios had accepted this, not happily, but he had accepted it because Shahanshah was right, and because Faladios was practical enough to recognize that being right is more important than being happy, and that the man who insists on fighting the battle he wants rather than the battle that needs to be fought is a man who loses wars. Now he moved through the western countryside with his 600 men. burning farms and cutting supply lines and destroying bridges, and doing everything in his power to ensure that when Orhan Sahib finally turned his attention west, he would find a landscape so damaged that rebuilding it would consume resources and time that the empire could not afford. He had already taken one outpost, a small one, barely more than a watchtower with a wall around it, garrisoned by 30 men who had fought bravely but who had been outnumbered 20-1 and had been overwhelmed in less than an hour. Palladios had offered them the choice of surrender or death. Most had chosen death, which Palladios respected, because he understood courage even when it was directed against him. He was moving toward the second outpost when his scouts reported something that made him pause. A force was approaching from the north, not large, perhaps 400 men, but moving quickly and with purpose, taking positions on the high ground along Palladios' line of march. Al-Din Sahib. Palladios stood on a hill and watched the northern force deploy. He studied their movements with the critical eye of a professional. He noted the placement of their scouts, the positioning of their cavalry, the way they used the terrain to maximize their advantage and minimize their exposure. And he nodded, almost appreciatively, because Al-Din Sahib knew what he was doing, and Palladios had enough professional pride to acknowledge competence in an opponent. He turned to his second in command. He said, "They are not trying to stop us. They are trying to slow us. They want to bleed us. They want to make us fight for every step so that their sultan has time to bring the main force west." His second said, "Then we should move quickly, push through them before reinforcements arrive." Palladios shook his head. He said, "No. If we push through, we expose our flanks. Al-Din will hit us from behind while we are engaged with the outpost ahead. We will be caught between two forces, one in front and one behind, and that is a trap I have no intention of walking into." He thought. The wind blew. The sun moved across the sky with the indifferent regularity of a celestial body that had witnessed 10,000 battles and would witness 10,000 more, and found none of them particularly interesting. Then Palladios said, "We change the game. We do not go to the second outpost. We swing south. We bypass Al-Din entirely. We hit the supply route between Bursa and the southern settlements. If we cut that route, we do not need to take the outposts. The outposts will starve without supplies and fall on their own." His second said, "And Al-Din?" Palladios said, "Al-Din will follow. Of course he will follow. He has no choice. But following is reactive, and reactive is slow, and slow is what we need him to be. Every day he spends chasing us is a day the outposts weaken. Every day the outposts weaken is a day closer to collapse. And when they collapse, Shahanshah moves in with his main force and takes everything between here and Bursa." He paused, then he added, almost to himself, "Yaqid was a fool. He thought he could play both sides and survive. He thought betrayal was a strategy. It is not a strategy. It is a symptom. A symptom of a man who does not understand that in this world there are only two positions, standing and fallen. There is no middle ground." He mounted his horse. He gave the order. 600 men turned south, away from Al-Din's blocking position, away from the second outpost, toward the supply route that was the economic artery of Orhan Sahib's western territories. And the game changed, again, as it always does, as it always will, because war is not a single contest with a single outcome. War is a series of contests, each one reshaping the landscape for the next, each one creating opportunities and threats that did not exist before, each one demanding that the men who wage it adapt and improvise and think not just about the battle they are fighting but about the battle that will come after, and the battle after that, and the battle after that, in an endless chain of violence and strategy and sacrifice that stretches from the beginning of human history to its end. Orhan Sahib received word of Palladios' southern turn while he was still a day's march from the western outposts. The messenger came from Al-Din, carried on a horse that was lathered and gasping. The message was brief. "Palladios has bypassed my position. He is moving south. I am pursuing but cannot match his speed. He is heading for the supply route. Recommend you redirect your force to intercept at the crossing of Karyoglan." Orhan studied the map. The crossing of Karyoglan was a ford where the main supply road crossed a river that was too deep to ford at any other point for 30 miles in either direction. If Palladios reached the crossing first and destroyed the bridge, the supply route would be severed. If Orhan reached the crossing first, he could hold it and force Palladios to either fight on Orhan's terms or withdraw. It was a race, not a race of armies, which are slow, cumbersome things that move at the speed of their slowest member, but a race of will, whose determination was greater, whose men could march farther and faster and harder without breaking. Orhan looked at Evanos. He said, "How fast can we move?" Evanos said, "Faster than we have been moving, but the infantry will have to be left behind. They cannot keep up. Only the cavalry can reach Karyoglan in time." Orhan said, "How many cavalry do we have?" Evanos said, 120, against Palladios' 600. Orhan was quiet, 120 against 600. The arithmetic was merciless. It was the kind of arithmetic that makes cautious men retreat and desperate men attack, and wise men look for a third option. Orhan said, "We do not need to defeat Faladios at Karayoglan. We need to hold the crossing until Altadin arrives from the north with his 400. Then we have 520 against 600, and the river at our backs and the bridge under our control. Those are odds I can work with." Evanos said, "How long must we hold?" Orhan said, "Altadin is a day behind Faladios. We must hold the crossing for 1 day. 1 day, again, 1 day, the eternal currency of war, not victory, not defeat, but time. The purchase of hours with blood, the exchange of lives for minutes, the desperate, brutal, agonizing mathematics of holding a position long enough for reinforcements to arrive." Evanos said, "We can hold for 1 day." Orhan said, "Then we ride. Now, leave the infantry to follow at their own pace. Cavalry only. Every man with a sword and a horse follows me. We ride through the night. We reach Karayoglan before dawn. We hold that crossing as though the doors of paradise are on the other side, because in a way they are." And they rode, 120 men on tired horses, riding through the failing light, riding through the gathering darkness, riding through the night with the stars above them and the road beneath them and the knowledge in their hearts that they were riding toward a place where 120 men would have to stand against 600, and that the mathematics said they should fail, but the faith said they would not, and the faith was stronger than the mathematics, and the faith was all they had. Orhan rode at the front. He always rode at the front, not because he was required to, not because it was expected, but because a sultan who asks his men to ride into danger and does not ride with them is a sultan in name only, and Orhan Sahib had never been content with names. He dealt in realities. And the reality was that his men needed to see him ahead of them, leading, not behind them, commanding, and the difference between those two things was the difference between an army that fights and an army that dies. Evanos rode beside him. His wound ached, his ribs throbbed, his eyes burned from exhaustion. But he rode because there was nothing else to do, because the woman he loved was behind him in a city that might be threatened, and the empire he served was crumbling at its edges, and the only thing standing between order and chaos was 120 men on horseback and the will of God. And the night was long, and the road was dark, and the stars looked down with their ancient, cold, indifferent light, and they saw what they always see, which is men riding toward their fate with their hearts in their throats and their swords at their sides and no certainty about anything, except the absolute, unshakable, bone-deep knowledge that what they are doing matters. It matters. It has always mattered. Every sword drawn in defense of something sacred, every prayer whispered in the darkness before a battle, every hand that reaches for another hand across the void of fear and finds it and holds on, every man who stands when it would be easier to kneel, every woman who holds a wall when it would be easier to flee. It matters. And the war is not over. It is not over at Karadera, where Turhan holds the narrows with his diminished force and waits for an enemy that may or may not return. It is not over in the west, where Faladios moves south with 600 men and the cold mathematics of destruction. It is not over at Karayoglan, where 120 men will stand at a river crossing and buy time with the only currency they have. It is not over in Constantinople, where Daphne has arrived and is whispering into the ears of powerful men, planting seeds of her own, seeds of vengeance and alliance and the promise of destruction. It is not over in the darkened room where Shahanshah sits alone and moves pieces on a board that only he can see, playing a game that has no rules and no referees and no end, only an endless series of moves and countermoves, each one bringing the world closer to a reckoning that none of them, not Shahanshah, not Orhan, not Turhan, not Faladios, not Evanos, not Fatima, not any of them can foresee. The war is not over. The story is not over. The night is deep and the road is long and the enemy is close and the dawn is uncertain. But the riders ride on. Because that is what they do. Because that is what they have always done. Because in the end, when all the strategies have been exhausted and all the alliances have been tested and all the prayers have been whispered and all the swords have been drawn, what remains is simply this. Men and women who refuse to stop. Who refuse to kneel. Who refuse to surrender. Who ride through the darkness toward an uncertain dawn with nothing but their faith and their courage and the deep, unshakable conviction that what they fight for is worth more than what they risk. And the dawn will come, it always comes, but what it illuminates, what it reveals, what it shows to the men and women who have survived the night, that is a story that has not yet been told. That is a story for the next fire. The next telling. The next breath. It is coming. It is close. But it is not here. Not yet. The grey horse beneath Evanos had nothing left. He could feel it in the animal's stride, the shortening of each step, the slight hitch in the rhythm that told an experienced rider the difference between fatigue and collapse. The horse was running on something beyond muscle now, something beyond training, something that existed in the space between the animal's will and the rider's need, and that something was finite, and it was running out. But Carrioglan was close. Evanos could smell the river, that particular scent of wet stone and mud, and the green decay of reeds that grows stronger the closer you get to moving water. He could hear it too, beneath the sound of hooves and breathing and the creak of leather and the jangle of bridles, the low, constant murmur of a river that has been flowing since before men named it, and will continue flowing long after the last man who remembers its name has turned to dust. Orhan Sahib raised his fist. The column slowed, then stopped. The horses stood in the darkness, their sides heaving, their breath coming in great white plumes that hung in the cold air like ghosts reluctant to depart. Head barely visible in the grey light that precedes dawn by perhaps an hour, the crossing of Carrioglan materialized out of the darkness. The bridge was a simple structure, stone pilings sunk into the riverbed with heavy timber planks laid across them, wide enough for a cart, strong enough for cavalry, essential enough that its destruction would sever the supply artery that fed the entire Western Territory. On the far side of the bridge, the road continued south into rolling hills and farmland. On this side, the near side, the ground rose slightly before dropping to the riverbank, creating a natural embankment that a defending force could use as a rampart. Orhan studied the terrain. Even in near darkness, even exhausted, even with the weight of an empire pressing down on him like a physical force, his mind worked with the mechanical precision of a man who has been making tactical assessments since before he could read. He dismounted. He walked to the edge of the embankment and looked down at the bridge and the river and the approaches on both sides. He turned in a slow circle, knotting the tree line to the north, the open ground to the south, the rocky outcrop to the east that could serve as an observation post. Then he turned to Evanos and said, "We have perhaps 3 hours before Faladios arrives, perhaps less. In 3 hours, I need this position transformed from a river crossing into a fortress." Evanos dismounted, his legs nearly buckled. He locked his knees and forced himself upright and said, "Tell me what you need." Orhan said, "The bridge stays intact. If we destroy it, we protect ourselves, but we also lose the ability to counterattack across the river when Altadin arrives. I want the bridge defended but not destroyed. Place 30 men on the far side in a forward position. They are there to slow Faladios down, to force him to deploy from march column into battle formation to buy us time. When they are pressed too hard, they fall back across the bridge in good order, and we collapse the forward defenses." Evanos said, 30 men on the far side, against 600. You are asking them to die." Orhan looked at him, his eyes were steady, his voice was quiet. He said, "I am asking them to hold for as long as they can and then retreat. I am not asking them to die. I am asking them to be willing to die, which is not the same thing. There is a difference between sacrifice and suicide, Evanos, and the difference is hope. Sacrifice is what a man offers when he believes his offering will accomplish something. Suicide is what a man commits when he believes nothing can be accomplished. I am offering these men sacrifice, not suicide. Their stand will slow Faladios. Their retreat will draw him toward the bridge. And when he reaches the bridge, he will find 100 men waiting on the other side with arrows and swords, and the determination of people defending the last thing that stands between their homes and destruction." Evanos was quiet. Then he said, "Who commands the forward 30? Orhan said, "You do." Evanos blinked. He said, "My Sultan." Orhan said, "You are the best man I have for this. You have already fought at Kara Dera. You have already ridden through the night. You know what it means to hold a position against odds that the mathematics say are impossible, and you have something that makes you more dangerous than any soldier I have ever commanded." Evanos said, "What is that?" Orhan said, "Something to live for. A man who fights because he is willing to die is brave. A man who fights because he is desperate to live is unstoppable. You have a reason to survive this day, Evanos. Use it. Let it make you faster. Let it make you sharper. Let it make you the kind of opponent that Faladios has never faced and never wants to face again." Evanos stood very still. The river murmured. The darkness thinned. Somewhere in the east, the first faint suggestion of light touched the horizon. Not yet dawn, but the promise of dawn, the whisper that precedes the shout. He said, "I will hold the far side for as long as I can, my Sultan, and then I will bring my men back across the bridge, every man alive. I will not leave anyone behind." Orhan placed his hand on Evanos' shoulder. The gesture was brief. The pressure was firm. And then it was gone, and the Sultan was moving, issuing orders with the rapid, clipped precision of a man who has 3 hours to prepare for an engagement that will determine the fate of his western territories and intends to use every second of those 3 hours. The 120 men dismounted and went to work. They had no engineers. They had no construction materials beyond what the land provided. What they had was desperation and ingenuity, and the understanding that a man who is about to be attacked will find ways to fortify his position that would never occur to a man who is comfortable and safe. They dug, with swords, with daggers, with their hands. They scraped trenches into the embankment on the near side of the bridge. Shallow trenches, barely deep enough for a man to kneel in, but deep enough to provide some protection from arrows and to break the momentum of a cavalry charge. They gathered stones. The riverbank was littered with them, smooth stones worn by centuries of water, and the men carried them up the embankment and piled them along the lip of the trenches, creating a low wall that would stop nothing larger than an arrow, but that would force an attacker to climb over it. And a man who is climbing is a man who is not fighting, and that 1 second delay is the difference between blocking a sword stroke and taking it in the throat. They cut trees, not large ones because there was no time and no axes, but young saplings and thick branches, which they dragged to the approaches on the far side of the bridge and laid across the road in tangled heaps, creating obstacles that would slow infantry and stop cavalry and force Palladios's men to spend time clearing the road before they could advance. Evenos crossed the bridge with his 30 men and established his forward position. He placed them in a half-moon formation facing south, using a line of boulders near the road as their primary defense. He positioned his best archers at the center, where their field of fire was widest. He placed his swordsmen on the flanks where they could engage any enemy that tried to work around the sides. And he placed himself at the point of the half-moon, at the very tip, at the place where the first blow would fall, because a commander who puts himself behind his men is a commander who will not be followed, and Evenos needed these 30 men to follow him into something that looked very much like the end of the world. He looked at their faces. Some were veterans, men with scars and steady hands and eyes that had seen worse than this and survived. Others were younger, not as young as Selim bin Yusuf, who was still at Kara with Turhan, but young enough that the fear in their faces was visible and raw, and not yet covered by the mask of experience that older soldiers learn to wear. He said, "I will not lie to you. What we are about to do is the hardest thing most of you will ever be asked to do. We are 30 men and they are 600. The mathematics are against us. The odds are against us. Everything that can be measured and calculated says that we should not be standing here. But I will tell you something that cannot be measured and cannot be calculated. I will tell you about a man I knew, a young soldier named Selim, who stood at Kara yesterday with his knees shaking and his teeth chattering and fought like a lion. He fought not because he was unafraid, but because he decided that his fear would not make his decisions for him. He fought because the men beside him were fighting and he would not betray them. He fought because he believed, deep in his bones, that what he was defending was worth more than what he was risking. That is what I ask of you now, not courage, not heroism, just the decision, the simple, quiet, unspectacular decision, to stand beside the man next to you and not let him down. He paused. The light was growing. The eastern sky was shifting from black to grey to the palest, most tentative shade of gold, as though the sun was not sure it wanted to see what was about to happen. Then Evenos said, "We hold until we cannot hold. Then we fall back across the bridge in good order. No panic, no rout. We move together, we fight together, we retreat together. No man is left behind. I swear this to you on everything I hold sacred. If you fall, I will carry you. If you cannot walk, I will drag you. We leave this position together or we do not leave it at all." The men were quiet. The river spoke for them, its ceaseless murmur filling the silence with a sound that was neither comforting nor threatening, but simply present, the sound of the world going on regardless of what men did upon its surface. Then a veteran, a man with grey in his beard and a scar that ran from his left eye to his jawline, said, "We stand with you, Commander. Allah is with us." And the others nodded, not with enthusiasm, not with the bravado that young men sometimes mistake for bravery, with something quieter, something more honest, the nod of men who are afraid and know they are afraid and have decided to do the thing they are afraid of anyway, because the alternative is worse than the fear. Evenos nodded back. He said, "Then let us pray, because the dawn is coming and with it, whatever God has written for us." They prayed, 30 men standing in a half-moon behind a line of boulders on the wrong side of a river, facing south, facing the direction from which death would come riding on 600 horses. They raised their hands and spoke the words and bowed their heads and prostrated, touching their foreheads to the cold, damp earth, and in that act, in that simple, ancient, universal act of submission to something great than themselves, they found what they needed, not the absence of fear, the presence of something stronger. When they rose, the sun was up. Not fully, not yet, but enough to illuminate the world in that clear, merciless, beautiful light that the first hour of morning provides, when every detail is sharp and every color is vivid and every shadow is long and dark and the world looks exactly like what it is, which is a place of terrible beauty and beautiful terror, and no certainty about anything except the fact that this moment, right now, is real. And then the scouts came back, 2 riders galloping hard, their horses throwing up clods of mud and grass. They reined in beside Evanos, and one of them said, breathing hard, 600, maybe more, half a league south, moving fast, cavalry in the front, infantry behind. They will be here within the hour. Evanos said, formation. The scouts said, column of march. They have not deployed yet, they do not know we are here. Evanos felt something cold and sharp settle in his chest. An hour, 60 minutes, perhaps less if Palladios was pushing his horses. 60 minutes between now and the moment when 600 men would crest the southern rise and see 30 men standing between them and the bridge, and would wonder briefly whether those 30 men were insane or merely very, very determined. He sent one of the scouts across the bridge to inform Orhan. Then he turned to his men and said, they do not know we are here. That is our first advantage. When they see us, they will have to stop and deploy. They cannot charge a defended position in column of march without losing their lead elements to our archers. That deployment will take time. Time is our friend. Every minute they spend forming up is a minute they are not attacking. Every minute they are not attacking is a minute closer to Altadin's arrival. He pointed at the obstacles they had laid across the road. He said, when they deploy and advance, they will hit the obstacles first. That will slow them further. While they are clearing the road, our archers fire into them from behind the boulders. We do not aim for kills, we aim for horses. A man whose horse has been shot from under him is a man who is now on foot in a cavalry action, and a man on foot in a cavalry action is a man with very limited options. He paused. He said, when they clear the obstacles and come for us, we hold behind the boulders for as long as the position is tenable. When I give the order to fall back, we fall back, not before, not after, when I say, together, across the bridge, into the positions that the Sultan has prepared on the other side. He looked at them one more time. He said, any questions? Silence, the river, the wind, the distant sound of birds that did not know or care that men were about to kill each other on the banks of their nesting ground. Evanos said, then we wait. And they waited. Waiting was worse than the fighting. It was always worse. In combat, the body takes over, the training engages, the fear is metabolized into energy, and the energy is burned in the furnace of action. But in the waiting, there is nothing to burn. The fear sits in the stomach like a stone, cold and heavy and immovable, and the mind, with nothing to do and no distraction to occupy it, turns inward and begins to catalogue every reason why this is a terrible idea and every way in which it could end in death. Evanos felt it. He felt the stone in his stomach. He felt his mind reaching for the dark places where the worst possibilities lived. He felt the tremor in his hands that had nothing to do with cold or injury, and everything to do with the ancient, primitive, uncontrollable response of a human body that knows it is about to be in mortal danger. He thought of Fatima. He did not try to think of her. He simply did the way a compass needle turns toward north, not by choice but by nature. He saw her face, her smile, that impossible, infuriating, world-remaking smile. He heard her voice. Evanos, when you asked me how many men had sought my hand, none of them mattered. None of them were you. That is the only number that counts. And the stone in his stomach dissolved. Not completely, not permanently, but enough to allow him to breathe, enough to steady his hands, enough to let him look south toward the horizon where 600 men were approaching and think, not with confidence but with something close to it, I will survive this. I will hold this position, and I will bring my men back across the bridge, and I will ride back to Bursa, and I will stand before Fatima's family with Zarkute and Nasser beside me, and I will ask for her hand, and I will not be refused. I will not be refused because God does not bring a man through darkness this deep, only to deny him the light on the other side. Maybe. He hoped. He prayed. And then the southern horizon changed. It began as a darkening, a thickening of the air above the crest of the southern rise, as though the sky itself was bruising. Then the thickening resolved into dust, a column of dust rising into the morning air, golden in the new sunlight, beautiful if you did not know what was causing it, terrifying if you did. Then the first riders appeared on the crest, small figures at first, toy soldiers on toy horses, distant and almost unreal. Then they grew. They took on detail and dimension, and the unmistakable menace of armed men moving with purpose. The column was long, much longer than Evanos had expected. It stretched back beyond the crest of the rise, disappearing over the other side, and the steady, rhythmic sound of hooves on hard ground reached his ears like a drumbeat, like a heartbeat, like the pulse of something vast and hungry and patient. At the front of the column, riding slightly ahead of his officers, was Burhan Palladios. Evanos had never seen him before, but he recognized him immediately, because there are men whose presence announces itself before their faces are visible. Palladios rode with the particular posture of a man who has spent so much of his life on horseback that his body has forgotten how to be comfortable any other way. He was broad across the shoulders. His armor was functional, not decorative, dented and scarred from use. His helmet was plain iron, unadorned, the helmet of a man who cared more about stopping a sword than impressing an audience. Palladios reached the crest. He stopped. His column stopped behind him, a long ripple of deceleration that ran back through the ranks like a wave. He looked down at the bridge. He looked at the obstacles on the road. He looked at the half-moon of men behind the boulders. And then, across the distance that separated them, Evanos could have sworn he saw Palladios smile. Not a warm smile, not a pleasant smile. The smile of a professional who encounters an obstacle and finds it interesting rather than intimidating. Palladios turned to his officers. He spoke. Evanos could not hear the words, but he could see the gestures, the pointing, the deployment orders being relayed down the column. The cavalry began to spread out, moving from column into line, the riders fanning left and right like the fingers of a hand opening. Evanos counted. He counted as long as he could, as long as the deployment gave him identifiable units to count. He stopped counting at 500. There were more, many more. Shahanshah had given Palladios not 600, but closer to 800, or Palladios had picked up reinforcements along the way. The numbers did not matter in the way that numbers usually matter, because 30 against 600 and 30 against 800 are both impossible, and the difference between two kinds of impossible is a distinction without a difference. The veteran beside him, the man with the scar from eye to jaw, said, "That is a lot of men, Commander." Evanos said, "Yes." The veteran said, "More than we expected." Evanos said, "Yes." The veteran was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have a daughter. She is 7. Her name is Ice. If I do not come home, will you tell her that her father stood?" Evanos looked at him. He said, "You will tell her yourself, but if something prevents you, I will find her. And I will tell her that her father stood at Karaoglan with 29 brothers and did not take a single step backward. I will tell her that the enemies of Islam looked upon her father and knew fear. I will tell her this because it will be the truth." The veteran nodded. He adjusted his grip on his sword. He said, "Then let them come." And they came. Not all at once. Palladios was too experienced for that. He sent his skirmishers first, like cavalry on fast horses, riders whose job was not to engage but to probe, to test the defenses, to draw fire and identify the positions of the archers and the strength of the line. 20 riders came down the slope at a canter spreading wide, approaching the obstacles from multiple angles. Evanos watched them come. He held his hand up. His archers knocked their arrows. He waited. The skirmishers reached the obstacles. They rode along the tangled mess of branches and saplings, looking for gaps, testing the density of the barrier. 2 of them dismounted and began pulling branches aside, clearing a path. Evanos dropped his hand. 6 arrows flew. 2 found their marks. A horse screamed and went down, throwing its rider into the branches. A man clutched his shoulder and fell sideways from his saddle. The remaining skirmishers wheeled and retreated up the slope, riding low over their horses' necks, moving fast. Silence returned. The horse that had been hit was thrashing in the obstacles, tangled in branches, its screams carrying across the morning air like a sound from a nightmare. The rider who had been thrown was crawling away from it, dazed, disoriented. His comrade who had been hit in the shoulder was being helped back up the slope by 2 riders who had returned for him. Evanos said, "Hold, conserve arrows, that was a test, the next one will not be." Minutes passed. On the crest, Palladios' formation was complete. The cavalry was arrayed in a broad crescent, the wings curving forward, the center held back. Behind the cavalry, the infantry was forming up in dense blocks, shields forward, spears bristling, ready to follow the cavalry through whatever gap the horsemen created. Evanos looked at the formation and felt the cold understanding of a man who can read a tactical situation the way a scholar reads a manuscript. The crescent was designed to envelop. The wings would sweep around the flanks of his half-moon, surrounding it, cutting off the retreat to the bridge. The center would hold back until the flanks had closed, and then it would advance into the trap and crush whatever was caught inside. He could not let the flanks close. If the flanks closed, his 30 men would be surrounded and annihilated in minutes. He had to fall back before the envelopment was complete, which meant he had even less time than he had thought. He turned to the 2 men closest to each flank. He said, "Watch the wings. When the cavalry starts moving, the wings will try to circle around us. Do not watch the center. The center is a distraction. Watch the wings." When the wings reach the line of that dead tree on the left and that outcropping of rock on the right, we fall back, not before. We need every second we can buy, but not after. After that, we are surrounded and we die here. They nodded, they understood, they did not want to die here. On the crest, a horn sounded. Low and long, a sound that carried across the morning air like the cry of something ancient and angry. The cavalry began to move, not fast, not yet, at a walk. A disciplined, measured, terrifying walk, 800 men moving forward in unison, the ground trembling beneath them, the sound of their advance filling the valley like the approaching roar of a flood. Evenos watched them come, his archers watched them come, his swordsmen watched them come, and every man among them felt the same thing, the same ancient, primal, overwhelming awareness of being small in the face of something immense, of being mortal in the presence of a force that seemed, in that moment, unstoppable. The walk became a trot, the trot became a canter. The wings began to spread, the riders on the flanks urging their horses faster, beginning the great sweeping arc that would carry them around the sides of Evenos's position and close the trap behind him. Evenos said, "Archers, center mass, fire at will." And the archers fired, not a volley this time but individual shots, each man choosing his target, each man aiming with the care of someone who knows that every arrow is precious and every miss is a waste that cannot be recovered. Arrows flew into the advancing center of Faladios's formation. Men fell, horses stumbled, but the line did not stop. It absorbed the casualties the way a river absorbs stones, flowing around them, closing the gaps, continuing forward with the relentless momentum of something that cannot be turned aside by anything short of a wall. The wings were moving faster now. Evenos could see them out of the corners of his eyes, the riders on the flanks galloping hard, their cloaks streaming behind them, their swords drawn, their voices rising in a battle cry that mixed with the thunder of hooves into a sound that was less heard than felt, a vibration in the chest, a trembling in the bones. The left wing reached the dead tree. Evenos saw it. He calculated the distance to the bridge, 60 paces, perhaps 70, 10 seconds at a run, more if they were fighting, too long if the right wing closed before they got there. The right wing reached the outcropping. Evenos stood, he shouted, "Fall back, now to the bridge together, move." And they moved, 30 men rising from behind their boulders and running, not in panic but in the disciplined haste of soldiers executing a planned withdrawal under pressure. The archers fired as they retreated, turning to loose arrows at the advancing center, slowing the pursuit by fractions of seconds that added up to the difference between life and death. The bridge was ahead. Evenos could see the timber planks, could see the water rushing beneath them, could see on the far side the earthworks and trenches that Orhan's men had prepared. He could see the Sultan himself, standing behind the stone wall, his sword drawn, his face set with an expression that was not fear or anger but something beyond both. The expression of a man who is watching his soldiers run toward him with an army at their heels, and is calculating, with terrible precision, the exact moment when he must order his archers to fire over their heads into the pursuing enemy. Evenos reached the bridge. His men were with him. He counted as they crossed. He counted every single one, standing at the near end of the bridge while arrows struck the planks around him and the thunder of approaching cavalry shook the earth. 28-29. He looked back. The 30th man, the veteran with the scar, was down, 30 paces from the bridge, on the ground, not moving, an arrow in his leg, and 600 men bearing down on him like the wrath of a god that does not forgive. Evenos did not think. Thinking requires time, and time was something he did not have. He ran, back across the bridge, back toward the veteran, back toward the wall of horses and steel that was seconds away from swallowing them both. He reached the veteran. The man was conscious. His eyes were wide. He said, "Leave me, Commander, leave me and get across the bridge." Evenos grabbed his arm. He hauled the man upright. He threw the veteran's arm over his shoulder and took his weight and turned toward the bridge and ran, dragging, carrying, stumbling, with the sound of hooves so close behind him that he could feel the hot breath of the lead horse on the back of his neck. And on the far side of the bridge, Orhan Sahib raised his sword. He held it aloft for 1 heartbeat, 2, 3, waiting until Evenos and the veteran were on the bridge, waiting until they were across, waiting until the first pursuing cavalry reached the near end of the bridge and began to cross. Then he brought the sword down, and 100 archers fired. The volley struck the lead riders on the bridge like the fist of God. Horses screamed and fell, and the riders behind them collided with the fallen, and the bridge became a chaos of thrashing animals and shouting men, and the terrible, grinding, crunching sound of armored bodies piling up on timber planks that groaned under the weight. The pursuit stopped, not because the enemy chose to stop, but because the bridge was blocked by their own dead and dying, a barricade more effective than anything that human hands could build, a barricade of flesh and bone and the consequences of momentum. Evanose and the veteran collapsed behind the stone wall on the near side. The veteran was bleeding. The arrow was deep, but he was alive. He looked up at Evanose with eyes that were glazed with pain and bright with something else, something that might have been gratitude, or might have been wonder, or might have been the simple, overwhelming relief of a man who expected to die alone on the wrong side of a river, and instead finds himself alive on the right side with a man who came back for him. He said, "You came back." Evanose was breathing so hard he could barely speak. He said, "I told you, no man left behind." The veteran closed his eyes. He whispered something. It might have been a prayer, it might have been a name. Ice. And then the battle for the bridge began. It was not the open, sweeping engagement of Cara Dera. It was something different, something tighter, something more personal. It was fighting measured in feet rather than miles, in seconds rather than hours. The bridge was narrow enough that only 8 or 10 men could cross abreast, and the near side was defended by 100 men in prepared positions, and the result was a meat grinder, a place where Faladios's numerical advantage was neutralized by the terrain, and where every attempt to force a crossing was met with a storm of arrows and steel that turned the bridge into a slaughterhouse. Faladios tried 3 times in the first hour. 3 times he sent his best men across the bridge in tight formations, shields locked, heads down, moving as fast as the bodies of the fallen would allow. 3 times they were met at the near end by Orhan's swordsmen, who fought with the particular savagery of men defending their last position, and 3 times they were driven back, leaving more dead on the bridge, building the barricade of bodies higher and higher until the bridge itself was barely passable. After the 3rd attempt, Faladios pulled back. He stood on the far bank and looked at the bridge and the bodies and the men on the other side, and he made a calculation that was part military and part personal and part something else entirely, something that had to do with the kind of man he was and the kind of defeat he was willing to accept. He sent riders upstream and downstream, looking for another crossing. There was none within practical distance. The river was deep and fast, and any attempt to ford it would leave his men wet, cold, exhausted, and vulnerable to attack from the defended bank. He could wait, he had supplies. He could camp on the far side and starve the defenders out, but time was not his ally. Every hour he waited was an hour closer to Altadin's arrival from the north, and if Altadin arrived while Faladios was still on the wrong side of the river, the hunter would become the hunted. He could try to build a new crossing, fell trees, construct a makeshift bridge upstream or downstream, away from the defended position, but that would take time too, and it would split his force, and a split force is a vulnerable force. Faladios stood on the bank and thought. And while he thought, the sun climbed higher and the morning advanced, and the shadows shortened, and the dead on the bridge began to stiffen in the warmth, and the flies began to gather, and the river flowed on, red now, carrying with it the blood of men who had died for the ambitions of rulers they had never met. On the near bank, Orhan Saheb used the respite to reorganize. He redistributed arrows from the dead to the living. He had the wounded moved to a sheltered area behind the embankment where Nasser Celebi, who had arrived with the infantry column that had been following at a slower pace, was organizing a medical station with the limited supplies available. Nasser worked with the frantic efficiency of a man who knows that his skills are the only thing standing between the wounded and death. He bound wounds, he removed arrows. He cauterized bleeding with heated blades, holding men down while they screamed, whispering apologies that he meant and prayers that he meant more. He was not a physician. He was an administrator, a counter of coins and barrels and bolts of cloth. But war does not ask what a man is trained for. War asks what a man is willing to do. And Nasser Celebi was willing to do whatever was necessary, however horrifying, however far outside his competence, because the alternative was watching men die while he stood by with clean hands and a clear conscience, and that was an alternative his conscience would never permit. Evanose sat against the stone wall and let a young soldier bind the wound on his arm, which had reopened during the retreat and was bleeding freely again. He was exhausted beyond the capacity of language to describe. His body was a catalogue of pain, the arm, the ribs, the legs that burned from running, the shoulders that ached from carrying the veteran across the bridge. But beneath the pain, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the fog of fatigue that threatened to pull him down into unconsciousness, there was something else, something bright and hard and inextinguishable. He had brought them all back, all 30, every man, alive. He had kept his promise. And the bridge was held. For now, the second assault came in the early afternoon. Faladios had spent the intervening hours clearing the dead from the bridge, a grim and necessary task that his men performed in shifts, dragging the bodies of their comrades to the far bank and laying them in rows, covering their faces with cloaks, working in silence because there are no words for the work of handling the dead, no phrases that make it bearable, no rhetoric that transforms the weight of a lifeless body in your arms into something other than what it is. When the bridge was clear, Palladios sent infantry this time. Not cavalry. Infantry with heavy shields and long spears, formed into a tight column that filled the bridge from rail to rail, shields overlapping like the scales of some great armored beast. They advanced slowly, deliberately, absorbing the arrows that struck their shields with the dull thud of iron on wood, advancing step by step, inch by inch, trading speed for protection. Orhan watched them come. He said to Evanos, who had insisted on returning to the line despite his wounds, "They are using a tortoise formation. Our arrows cannot penetrate the shield wall from the front. We need to fire from above. We need elevation." Evanos looked around. There was no elevation. The embankment was low. The terrain behind them was flat. The only high ground was the rocky outcrop to the east, but it was too far from the bridge for effective archery. Then Evanos said, the trees along the bank. Put archers in the trees. They fire down into the tortoise from above. The shields cannot protect against a plunging angle." Orhan said, "Do it." Evanos grabbed 6 archers. He led them to the trees that lined the riverbank near the bridge. Old willows, their branches hanging low over the water, their trunks thick and gnarled and climbable. The archers climbed. They found positions in the canopy, bracing themselves against branches, knocking arrows, looking down at the bridge from an angle that the tortoise formation had not been designed to defend against. The tortoise was halfway across when the first arrows came from above. They fell almost vertically, dropping into the gaps between shields, finding the exposed backs and shoulders and necks of men who had tilted their shields forward to protect against frontal fire and had no protection against attacks from overhead. Men screamed, the formation wavered. Shields shifted as men tried to cover the new angle, and when the shields shifted, gaps opened in the wall, and the archers on the embankment fired into those gaps with devastating effect. The tortoise broke apart, not all at once but in pieces, shields dropping as their bearers fell, spears clattering to the planks, men stumbling over the wounded, the tight discipline that had held the formation together, dissolving under the pressure of attack from 2 directions simultaneously. Orhan's swordsmen charged onto the bridge and met the remnants of the formation at the midpoint, and the fighting was close and brutal and merciless, blade against blade, shield against shield, the grunting and cursing and screaming of men killing each other at arm's length. And the bridge ran red again, and the river carried the blood downstream, and the willows swayed in the wind, and the archers in their branches fired and fired and fired until their quivers were empty, and then they climbed down and drew their swords and joined the fight on the bridge. The infantry fell back, what was left of them, perhaps half of what had started across. They retreated to the far bank and collapsed, and Palladios stood among them with his arms folded and his face expressionless and said nothing because there was nothing to say. He had tried direct assault. He had tried the tortoise. Both had been stopped. The bridge was a death trap, and as long as it was defended, it would remain a death trap. He looked at the sun. It was past its peak. The afternoon was advancing. Altadin would arrive by tomorrow morning at the latest. If Palladios had not taken the crossing by then, his entire campaign would unravel. The supply route would remain intact. The western outposts would be resupplied. Shahanshah's grand strategy would collapse like a house built on sand. Palladios made his decision. He called his officers together. He spoke to them quietly, his voice low enough that only they could hear. What he said was this: "We cannot take the bridge by force. It is too narrow, too well defended, and every assault costs us more than we can afford. But there is another option. We do not need to cross the bridge, we need to destroy it. If the bridge is gone, the supply route is severed regardless of who holds the near bank. The outposts will starve. The mission will be accomplished. Not the way I wanted it, but accomplished nonetheless." His officers looked at each other. One of them said, "How do we destroy the bridge if we cannot reach it?" Palladios said, "Fire. We burn it. We soak arrows in oil and pitch. We fire them into the timber. The bridge is old and dry, and it will burn." Another officer said, "But if we burn the bridge, we cannot cross. We trap ourselves on this side of the river." Palladios said, "We do not need to cross. Our mission is not to take Bursa. Our mission is to destroy the supply route. If the bridge burns, the mission is complete. We withdraw south and rendezvous with Shahanshah's forces." The officers were quiet. They understood the logic. They did not like it because soldiers never like retreating, even when retreat is the wisest course, but they understood. And across the river on the near bank, Evanos saw the preparations beginning. He saw men heating pots over fires. He saw the dark gleam of pitch being ladled onto arrow points. He saw archers forming up with bundles of oil-soaked rags, and he understood, with a sickening drop in his stomach, what was about to happen. He ran to Orhan. He said, "My sultan, they are preparing fire arrows. They are going to burn the bridge." Orhan's face changed. The calculation was instant and devastating. If the bridge burned, Tarhan would hold Karadera for nothing. If the bridge burned, the supply route would be severed. If the bridge burned, every outpost in the west would be cut off and would fall within weeks. Everything they had fought for, everything they had bled for, everything they had ridden through the night and held the line and carried wounded men across under a rain of arrows for would be for nothing. Orhan said, "We must stop them." Evanos said, "How? We cannot reach them from this side. Our archers do not have the range to suppress their fire positions." Orhan looked at the bridge, he looked at the river, he looked at the willows, he looked at the sky. Then he said, "We do not stop the arrows, we protect the bridge. Get every man who is not holding a weapon to the river. Soak blankets, soak cloaks, soak anything that holds water. Lay them over the bridge timbers. Wet wood does not burn easily. It can be set alight, but it takes time, and time is what we have been buying all day, and we will buy more now." Evanos turned and ran. Within minutes, a line of men stretched from the river to the bridge, passing soaked blankets and cloaks, and even shirts from hand to hand, draping them over the timber planks, dousing the wood with water carried in helmets and boots, and anything else that could hold liquid. And then the fire arrows came. They came in arcs of flame, trails of orange and gold against the pale afternoon sky, beautiful in the way that all destructive things are beautiful, the beauty of a thing that does not care what it destroys, that serves no purpose beyond annihilation, that turns what was built into what was not and calls the transformation progress. Arrows struck the bridge. Some hit the wet blankets and sizzled and died, their flames smothered by the soaked cloth. Others found dry patches where the coverage was incomplete and took hold, small fires that bloomed and spread with the eager hunger of flame on seasoned timber. Men ran onto the bridge to extinguish the fires. They beat the flames with wet cloth, they poured water from helmets, they stamped with their boots, and while they fought the fire, more arrows came, and some of the arrows did not hit the bridge, they hit the men. And men who are beating out flames are men who are not holding shields, and men who are not holding shields are men who are terribly, fatally exposed. 2 men fell, then 3, then a 4th, an arrow in his back, collapsing onto the bridge with a cry that was cut short when the flames he had been fighting caught his clothing and turned him into a torch. Evanos was on the bridge. He dragged the burning man to the edge and rolled him into the river. The water extinguished the flames, but the man did not resurface. Evanos stared at the water for 1 frozen second. Then he turned back to the bridge and continued fighting the fire. It was hopeless, he knew it was hopeless. The fire arrows were coming too fast, the dry patches too many, the men too few. One by one, the wet blankets caught fire and burned and exposed the timber beneath, and the timber began to smoke, and the smoke turned to flame, and the flame began to spread. Evanos stood in the center of the bridge with fire on both sides, and looked back at Orhan on the near bank, and Orhan looked at him, and their eyes met across the smoke, and the flame and the chaos, and Evanos understood what the Sultan's eyes were saying. "Fall back, let it go, save yourself." And Evanos wanted to obey, every fiber of his body wanted to obey, but the bridge, if the bridge burned, everything burned with it, the supply route, the western outposts, the strategy, the future. And Fatima's face was in his mind, Fatima's voice, "Come back alive, we have unfinished business, you and I." He fell back, he ran through the fire. He felt it reach for him, felt the heat sear his skin through his armor, felt his cloak catch and trail fire behind him like a comet's tail. He reached the near end of the bridge and threw himself off the side into the river, and the cold water hit him like a fist and closed over his head, and for a moment there was nothing but darkness and cold and the muffled sound of the world continuing without him. He surfaced, hands reached down and pulled him out. He lay on the bank, gasping, steaming, his cloak gone, his armor blackened, his eyebrows singed, but alive. Alive. And behind him, the bridge burned. It burned slowly at first, the wet sections resisting, the flames finding their way around the soaked patches, advancing timber by timber, plank by plank. Then faster, as the heat dried the wood ahead of the flame front, and the fire found its rhythm, and began to consume the bridge with the steady, implacable appetite of something that cannot be reasoned with or bargained with or stopped. The center of the bridge collapsed first. The timbers gave way with a groan that sounded almost human, and a section of the roadway dropped into the river, sending up a column of steam and ash and sparks that rose into the afternoon sky like a prayer made of fire. Orhan watched the bridge die. His face was stone. His eyes were fire. He watched the timbers fall and the flames consume, and the structure that had connected one bank to the other, one part of his empire to another, reduce itself to charred pilings jutting from the water like the ribs of a great beast that had died standing up. Behind him, his men were silent. They had fought all day. They had held the bridge against impossible odds. They had bought time, hour by hour, life by life, and now the thing they had been defending was gone, and the silence of men who have given everything and lost anyway is the heaviest silence in the world. But then, a sound from the north. A horn, distant but unmistakable. A horn that played a sequence of notes that every man in Orhan's army recognized, because it was the call signal of the northern garrison, the signature of Altadin Sahib. Heads turned, eyes strained northward, and there on the ridgeline above the river, silhouetted against the afternoon sky, riders appeared, dozens of them, then scores, then hundreds. A column of cavalry and infantry flowing over the crest of the ridge like water over a dam, banners snapping in the wind, armor glinting in the slanting light, the horn calling again and again, announcing their arrival with a sound that was both music and war cry and promise. Altadin Sahib had arrived. Not tomorrow morning, not in 12 hours. Now, he had pushed his men through the night, exactly as Turhan had done, exactly as Evanos had done, exactly as Orhan himself had done, because he had understood the message that the Sultan's rider had brought him. Not just the words, the urgency beneath the words, the desperation beneath the urgency. And he had responded the way a man responds when his Sultan calls and his empire needs him, and every hour of delay is an hour that could cost everything. 400 men, fresh, armed, angry. They poured down the ridge toward the river. Altadin himself rode at the front, a massive man on a massive horse, his voice carrying across the valley as he shouted orders and encouragement, and the name of Allah in a continuous stream that was part command and part prayer and part battle cry. On the far bank, Faladios saw them. He saw the banners and the glinting armor and the sheer number of fresh troops arriving, and he made the final calculation of the day, the calculation that every commander dreads but that every honest commander eventually faces. He was outnumbered now. His men were tired. His assault force had been bled by 2 failed bridge crossings and the fire arrow operation. The bridge was destroyed, which meant his mission was accomplished, but it also meant he had no way to cross the river, no way to threaten the near bank, no way to do anything except stand on the wrong side of a river and watch a superior force gather against him. He could fight, he could always fight. Faladios was a man who could always fight, but fighting now would not serve his mission. It would serve only his pride, and Faladios, unlike Yakid, unlike Shahanshah, was not a man who confused pride with strategy. He gave the order to withdraw. His army turned south. 800 men, reduced by casualties to perhaps 650, moved away from the river crossing in good order, their rear guard watching the near bank for any sign of pursuit, their column tight and disciplined, despite the exhaustion and the defeat and the knowledge that they were walking away from a fight they had not won. Faladios rode at the rear. He was the last man to leave. He sat on his horse and looked across the river at the burning remnants of the bridge and the men who had defended it and the reinforcements streaming down the ridge, and his face showed nothing. No anger, no frustration, no defeat, just the blank, professional composure of a man who has played his hand and lost this round and is already thinking about the next. He turned his horse south. He rode away, and the sound of his army's departure faded into the distance until there was nothing left but the river and the wind and the crackle of dying flames and the slow, exhausted breathing of men who had survived. On the near bank, Orhan Sahib stood among his soldiers and looked at the ruined bridge and felt the full weight of what had happened settle on his shoulders. The bridge was gone. The supply route was severed. Faladios had accomplished his mission, even in retreat. The western outposts would need to be resupplied by an alternate route, a longer route, a more expensive route, a route that would strain resources that were already stretched thin. It was not a victory. It was not a defeat. It was something in between, something that war produces more often than either victory or defeat, a result that is ambiguous and costly and unsatisfying, and that leaves both sides diminished. But his men were alive, most of them, not all but most, and the enemy had been stopped from advancing further, and Altadin had arrived, and Turhan still held Kara Dera, and Bursa still stood, and the empire, battered and bleeding and running on faith and stubbornness, still stood with it. Altadin dismounted and approached the Sultan. He was breathing hard. He was covered in dust. He looked like a man who had ridden through a sandstorm and emerged on the other side with nothing left but his loyalty and his sword. He knelt, he said, "My Sultan, I came as fast as I could. I am sorry I was not faster." Orhan reached down and lifted him to his feet. He said, "You came when you were needed, Altadin. That is all that can be asked of any man. Stand beside me. There is work to do." Altadin stood. He looked at the bridge. He looked at the dead. He looked at the exhausted, bloodied, unbroken men who had held the crossing for an entire day against impossible odds. And he said quietly, with the reverence of a man witnessing something sacred, "These men, what they have done today, history will remember this." Orhan said, "History will remember what we do next. What we have done today keeps us alive. What we do tomorrow determines whether we stay alive." He turned to Evenos. Evenos was sitting on the bank, his feet in the water, his blackened armor steaming, his face a landscape of burns and bruises and exhaustion. He looked up at the Sultan and tried to stand and could not. His body had finally, irrevocably, reached its limit. Orhan knelt beside him. He said, "Evenos, you have given enough today, more than enough. Rest." Evenos said, "The bridge, my Sultan, we lost the bridge." Orhan said, "We lost a bridge. We kept an empire. Bridges can be rebuilt. The men who defended this crossing cannot be replaced. You brought all 30 back, Evenos, every man, as you promised." Evenos closed his eyes. The river lapped at his boots. The sun was going down, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that seemed in that moment less like a sunset and more like a reflection of what had happened on the bridge, the fire and the blood, and the golden courage of men who had stood when everything said they should fall. He whispered, "Fatima." Orhan heard it. He said nothing. He placed his hand on Evenos's shoulder, the same gesture he had used that morning, brief and firm, and full of everything that words cannot carry. Then he stood. He looked west, toward the horizon where Faladios had disappeared. He looked east, toward Kara Dera where Turhan still held. He looked north, where Altadin's men were making camp. He looked south, toward the ruined bridge and the river that now separated his western territories from his supply lines. He said to no one and to everyone, "We rebuild. Tomorrow, we rebuild the bridge. We reopen the supply route. We reinforce the outposts. We bury our dead. We tend our wounded. We pray for the fallen. And then we turn our eyes toward Shahanshah and we make him understand that what he has broken, we will repair. What he has burned, we will rebuild. What he has taken, we will take back. And the price he will pay for this day will be measured not in gold or territory, but in the knowledge, the absolute, inescapable knowledge that he cannot break us. He cannot burn us. He cannot outlast us, because we are not fighting for land. We are not fighting for power. We are fighting for something that does not burn and cannot be broken and will outlast every empire that has ever risen or will ever rise." He paused, the wind blew, the river flowed, the sun set. He said, "We are fighting for what is right. And what is right does not die, it does not retreat, it does not surrender, it stands." And the men who heard him, the exhausted, bloodied, burned, unbroken men who had held the crossing of Karyoglan against 800 enemies for an entire day, felt something move in their chests. Not a second wind, not a surge of energy, something deeper, something that existed below the level of muscle and bone, in the place where the soul lives, in the place where a man's identity is formed and tested, and either broken or forged into something that cannot be broken. They felt their Sultan's words settle into that place. They felt them take root, and they knew, with the certainty that only those who have been tested to their absolute limit can possess, that they would stand again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Because the war was not over. And they were not finished. Not even close. Not even close. And far to the east, at Kara Dera, Turhan stood on his ridge and looked at the stars, and whispered a prayer for the men in the west, and waited for the dawn. And in Bursa, Malhun Khatun stood on the walls, and looked west and whispered a prayer for her husband, and waited for his return. And in the women's quarters, Fatima held a sword across her knees, and looked at nothing, and whispered a prayer for Evenos and waited. And in Constantinople, in a darkened room overlooking the sea, Daphne sat across from a man whose name would shake the foundations of every throne in Anatolia when it was finally spoken aloud, and she smiled, and her smile was not the smile of a woman who has found peace, but the smile of a woman who has found a weapon, and the weapon was more devastating than any army. And the night deepened, and the story continued. As it must, as it will, until the last page is turned, and the last word is spoken, and the last breath of the last storyteller fades into a silence that is not empty but full, full of every story ever told, every battle ever fought, every prayer ever whispered, every love ever declared in the shadow of a war that never ends. The war never ends. But neither does the courage. Neither does the faith. Neither does the love. And that, perhaps, is enough. Perhaps. The stars above Karyoglan turned slowly through the night sky, ancient light traveling impossible distances to illuminate a landscape of exhaustion and aftermath. Men slept where they had fallen, too tired to find proper bedding, too drained to care about comfort. The river whispered its endless song, carrying downstream the last traces of blood and ash, and the memories of a day that would live in the minds of every survivor until the moment of their deaths. Evenos did not sleep. He could not. His body had passed beyond fatigue into some strange territory where exhaustion became a kind of wakefulness, where the nerves refused to quiet and the mind refused to rest, spinning endlessly through images of fire and steel, and the faces of men who had trusted him and followed him and lived because he had kept his promise. He sat against a tree near the riverbank, his ruined armor removed and piled beside him, his burned cloak discarded, wearing only the simple tunic that had been beneath the metal. The burns on his arms and face had been treated with whatever salve Nasser could find, and they throbbed with a low, persistent pain that was almost comforting in its constancy, a reminder that he was still alive, still capable of feeling, still present in a world that had tried very hard to remove him from it. The veteran was nearby, the man with the scar from eye to jaw, whose name Evanos had learned was Kasim, whose daughter was named Ice, who had taken an arrow in the leg and been left behind and been carried across a burning bridge by a commander who had promised no man would be abandoned. Kasim was awake too. His leg was splintered and bound, the arrow removed by Nasser's trembling but determined hands, the wound cauterized with heated iron while Kasim bit down on a leather strap and did not scream, because screaming would have meant the pain had beaten him, and Kasim was not a man who let pain win. He said quietly, so as not to wake the men sleeping around them, "Commander." Evanos turned his head. He said, "You should be resting." Kasim said, "So should you, but here we are." Evanos almost smiled. He said, "Here we are." Kasim was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have been thinking about what you did, on the bridge, coming back for me, running into the fire, carrying me across." Evanos said, "I made a promise." Kasim said, "Yes, you made a promise, but many men make promises, Commander. Many men say the words. Few men run through fire to keep them. I have served under commanders who promised many things and delivered few. I have seen men die because their leaders were more concerned with their own survival than with the survival of those they led. But you came back, you could have reached safety. You were across the bridge, the fire was behind you, and you turned around and ran back into it, for me. A man you barely knew, a man whose name you had learned only hours before." Evanos looked at the river. The water moved in the moonlight like liquid silver, beautiful and cold and indifferent to the affairs of men. He said, "When I was young, before I came to serve Orhan Sahib, I was alone. I had no family, no tribe, no one who would come back for me if I fell. I knew what it felt like to be abandoned. I swore that if I ever had the power to prevent another man from feeling what I had felt, I would use that power. Today I had the power, and I used it." "That is all." Kasim studied him. The scar on his face caught the moonlight and turned silver, a line of old violence that had healed but never faded. He said, "It is not all, it is everything. A leader who keeps his promises is a leader who will be followed into the fire, not because his men are ordered to follow, but because they choose to, because they know that if they fall, he will come back, because they know that their lives matter to him, not as numbers on a ledger, not as units on a map, but as men. As brothers, as souls that Allah has entrusted to his care." He paused, then he said, "Commander, I do not know what your future holds. I do not know if you will survive the next battle, or the one after that, or the one after that, but I know this, if you live, you will be remembered. Not as a man who won victories, though you may win many. Not as a man who held positions, though you held one today that should have been impossible to hold. You will be remembered as a man who kept his word. And in a world where words are cheap and honor is expensive, that is the rarest treasure of all." Evanos felt something move in his chest. Not pride, something deeper, something that had no name but that felt like the warmth of a fire in a cold room, like the touch of a hand in the darkness, like the first breath after nearly drowning. He said, "Thank you, Kasim. Thank you for those words. I will try to deserve them." Kasim said, "You already do. Now rest. Tomorrow will come whether we are ready for it or not." And they sat in silence, the two of them, watching the river flow and the stars turn and the night pass with the slow, inevitable patience of time that does not hurry for anyone, not for the wounded, not for the grieving, not for the triumphant, not for the defeated. And somewhere in that silence, between one breath and the next, Evanos finally slept. He dreamed of Fatima. He dreamed of her standing in the courtyard of the palace at Bursa, the morning light behind her, her face half in shadow, her smile the only illumination he needed. She was speaking to him, but he could not hear the words, only the tone of her voice, warm and teasing, and full of a love that had never needed to be declared, because it had always been present from the first moment, from the first glance, from the first impossible second when two souls recognized each other across the crowded, chaotic, blood-soaked landscape of their world. She reached out her hand, he reached for it, and just before their fingers touched, the dream dissolved and he was awake, and the dawn was breaking, and the world was calling him back to war. The morning at Karyoglan was a study in organized chaos. Altadin Sahib's men had established a proper camp during the night, setting up tents and cooking fires, and the various necessities of an army in the field. The smell of bread baking and meat roasting drifted across the encampment, and the men who had fought the previous day emerged from their scattered sleeping places like survivors of a shipwreck, crawling up onto a friendly shore. Orhan Sahib was already awake. He had not slept at all. The Sultan stood at the edge of the river, looking at the ruined bridge, his mind working through the logistics of what came next. The pilings were still standing. The stone supports, sunk deep into the riverbed, had survived the fire. Only the timber roadway had burned, and timber could be replaced. It would take days, perhaps a week, but it could be done. He turned when he heard footsteps behind him. It was Carlo, who had arrived with Altadin's column, having ridden through the night with them when he heard that the Sultan was marching west. Carlo looked exhausted, his scholar's hands raw from gripping reins for hours, his robes dusty and torn, his face showing the strain of a man who had spent his life with books and prayers, and was now immersed in the brutal realities of war. Carlo said, "My Sultan, I have been speaking with Nasser about the supply situation. The news is mixed." Orhan said, "Tell me." Carlo said, "The good news is that Altadin brought provisions with him, enough to feed both forces for perhaps 10 days. The western outposts have their own stores, which will sustain them for a while longer, though not indefinitely. The alternate supply route, through the northern passes, is longer and more difficult, but it is usable. We can keep the outposts alive while the bridge is rebuilt." Orhan said, "And the bad news?" Carlo hesitated. Then he said, "The bad news is that Faladios did more damage on his way here than we initially realized. He burned 3 villages. He destroyed 2 granaries. He poisoned at least 1 well that we know of, possibly more. The people in those areas are now refugees. They are fleeing toward Bursa, and they will need food, shelter, and care. The burden on our resources is increasing at the exact moment when our resources are most strained." Orhan absorbed this. His face did not change. He said, "The refugees will be cared for. They are our people. They fled because we failed to protect them. The least we can do is ensure they survive our failure." Carlo said, "My Sultan, it was not a failure. You could not have known that Shahanshah would sacrifice 2,000 men at Kara Dera as a diversion. The attack there was real. Turhan's defense was necessary. The strategy was sound. Shahanshah simply had more resources than we anticipated and was willing to spend them more recklessly." Orhan said, "A leader who is surprised by his enemy's resources has not done his work properly. I should have known. I should have had better intelligence. I should have seen through the diversion. That I did not is my failure, Carlo, and I will own it. What I will not do is wallow in it. The past is written. The future is not. Tell me what we need to do, and we will do it." Carlo nodded. He produced a scroll from within his robes, a list he had been compiling through the night. He said, "First, the bridge must be rebuilt. I recommend we begin immediately. Altadin's men can provide the labor while your men rest and recover. Second, the alternate supply route must be secured. I recommend sending a small force to patrol the northern passes and ensure Faladios has not left ambushes along the way. Third, the refugees must be gathered and directed to Bursa in an orderly manner. Panic and disorder will only increase the suffering. Fourth, we must send word to Turhan at Kara Dera. He needs to know that the western front is stabilized and that he can begin planning his own withdrawal or consolidation as circumstances permit. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, we must consider our next move against Shahanshah." Orhan looked at him. He said, "Our next move?" Carlo said, "Yes, my Sultan. We have survived his assault, but survival is not victory. As long as Shahanshah lives and commands armies, he will try again. His strategy failed this time, but he will learn from it. He will adapt. He will probe for new weaknesses. The question is not whether he will attack again. The question is when and where and whether we will be ready." Orhan was quiet for a long moment. The river flowed. The sun rose higher. The sounds of the camp grew louder as men woke and ate and began the work of another day. Then Orhan said, "You are right, Carlo. Survival is not victory, but before we can achieve victory, we must secure what we have. The bridge, the supply route, the outposts, the refugees. These are the immediate priorities. Once they are addressed, once our position is stabilized, then we turn our attention to Shahanshah. And when we do, Carlo, we will not simply defend against his attacks. We will bring the war to him. We will make him understand that the cost of threatening our lands is higher than any gain he could hope to achieve. We will break his will to fight, and we will do it so thoroughly that neither he nor any who come after him will ever look at our borders and see opportunity again." Carlo bowed his head. He said, "As you command, my Sultan." And the work began. The reconstruction of the bridge was supervised by Nasser Celebi, who had discovered during the chaos of the previous days that he had a gift for organization under pressure that he had never suspected he possessed. The same meticulous attention to detail that made him an excellent administrator made him an excellent construction foreman, and he threw himself into the work with the desperate energy of a man who needs to keep his hands busy lest his mind dwell on the horrors he had witnessed. Trees were felled, timber was cut. The burned remnants of the old roadway were cleared from the pilings and dropped into the river, where they would eventually be carried downstream and deposited somewhere far away, their story dissolved into the larger story of the water. New planks were laid, ropes were tied, the bridge began, slowly, painfully, inevitably, to take shape again. Evenos worked alongside the men. His burns made every movement painful, and Nasser tried several times to order him to rest, but Evenos would not rest. He could not rest. The work gave him something to focus on, something concrete and physical and productive, and he needed that focus the way a drowning man needs air. On the third day of reconstruction, a rider came from the east. He carried news from Tarhan at Kara, and the news was good. The enemy had not returned. The narrows remained secure. Tarhan had used the days since the battle to strengthen his positions and rotate his men through periods of rest. Morale was high. The men who had fought and bled at Kara understood that they had accomplished something significant, and that understanding gave them strength. Tarhan's message also contained a personal note for Arhan Saheb. It said simply, Evenos held. The words reached Arhan's ears and traveled to Evenos, and when Evenos heard them, he paused in his work and closed his eyes and felt something unknot in his chest, some tension he had been carrying since the bridge burned, some fear that his efforts had not been enough. Tarhan knew, Tarhan understood. Tarhan, who was the best warrior Evenos had ever known, who had stood at the head of 500 men and held an impossible position against an army, thought that what Evenos had done at Karyoglan mattered. It mattered. Evenos opened his eyes, he picked up his tools, he went back to work. On the fifth day, the bridge was complete. It was not as sturdy as the original, and it would need to be replaced properly when time and resources permitted, but it was functional. A cart could cross it, a cavalry column could cross it. The supply route was open again. Arhan walked across the new bridge from one end to the other. He stood in the middle and looked down at the river and felt the structure sway slightly beneath his weight and thought about everything that had been sacrificed to protect this crossing, the lives lost, the blood spilled, the fire endured. He thought about the men who had died on these planks, and the man who had carried a wounded veteran through the flames, and the woman who had stood on the walls of Bursa and watched her husband ride away without knowing if she would ever see him again. He thought about all of it, and then he crossed to the far side, and he gave the order that the first supply wagons should begin moving immediately, and the work of resupply began. The refugees arrived at Bursa in a steady stream over the following days. They came on foot, in carts on the backs of mules and donkeys. They came with whatever they had been able to carry when they fled, which was often nothing but the clothes on their backs and the fear in their eyes. They came with children crying and elders struggling, and the particular lost expression of people whose world has been torn apart and who do not yet know how to rebuild it. Malhun Khatun received them. She had organized the women of the palace into a relief effort, establishing shelters in the outer buildings of the city, setting up kitchens to feed those who arrived hungry, gathering blankets and clothing from those who had more than they needed, and distributing them to those who had nothing. She moved among the refugees with a calm, steady presence that communicated more than any words could. She touched children's heads and spoke to mothers, and listened to the stories of old men who had seen their farms burn and could not understand why. She did not offer false comfort. She did not promise that everything would be fine. She simply listened and acknowledged their pain, and assured them that they were safe now, that the walls of Bursa were strong, that the Sultan and his men would protect them. Fatima worked beside her. The leader of the Bajian had set aside her sword for the moment, though it was never far from her reach, and devoted herself to the practical work of caring for the displaced. She carried water. She distributed bread. She helped a young mother whose infant would not stop crying and discovered, through patient investigation, that the child had a fever and needed medicine, and she found the medicine and administered it, and stayed with the mother until the infant's cries subsided into exhausted sleep. It was work that no chronicle would ever record, work that required no steel and shed no blood, work that was as essential to the survival of the empire as any battle fought on any field. The refugees who arrived broken would either be restored or they would become a burden that would drag the entire structure down. Malhun and Fatima and the women who worked beside them understood this. They understood that empire is not built only with swords. It is built with bread and blankets and the patient, unglamorous labor of putting broken things back together. One evening, as the sun set over Bursa and the calls of the muezzins rose from the minarets, Fatima found herself standing on the walls looking west. The sky was red and gold and purple, colors that made her think of fire and blood and the endless repeating cycle of violence that seemed to define her world. She thought of Evenos out there somewhere, beyond the horizon, doing whatever it was that men did when they went to war. She thought of the words she had spoken to him before he left. None of them mattered, none of them were you. She had meant it, she had meant every word, but meaning words and speaking them are not the same as having them heard, and she did not know if he had heard, truly heard, what she was trying to tell him. She did not know if he understood that the games she played, the teasing and the deflecting and the pretense of indifference, were armor, protection against a world that had taught her from childhood that loving something too openly was the surest way to lose it. She did not know if he understood that when he rode away, a piece of her had ridden with him, and that piece would not return until he did. She heard footsteps behind her. She turned. It was Malhun Khartun, climbing the stone steps to the top of the wall, with the measured pace of a woman who has climbed these steps many times and knows exactly how much energy each one requires. Malhun reached the top and stood beside Fatima. Neither spoke for a moment. They simply looked west together, at the dying light, at the horizon that swallowed their men and their prayers and gave back only silence. Then Malhun said, "He will return." Fatima said, "How do you know?" Malhun said, "I do not know, I believe. There is a difference. Knowledge is what we have when all the evidence aligns. Belief is what we have when the evidence is uncertain, but we choose to trust anyway. Every time Orhan rides away, I do not know that he will return. I believe it. I choose to believe it. Because the alternative, the fear, the constant dread, the certainty of loss, that is a poison that will kill you long before any sword does." Fatima was quiet, then she said, "How do you bear it? The waiting, the uncertainty, the not knowing." Malhun said, "I bear it because I must. Because the alternative is not bearing it, and not bearing it means being broken, and being broken means being useless, and being useless means failing the people who depend on me. I am not allowed to be broken, Fatima. Neither are you. We are the ones who hold things together while the men are away. We are the foundation upon which they build their courage. If we crumble, everything crumbles, so we do not crumble. We stand, we wait. We believe, and when they return, we are there, whole and strong and ready, and they see us and they remember why they fight." Fatima looked at her. She said, "You make it sound simple." Malhun almost laughed. She said, "It is not simple. It is the hardest thing I have ever done, but hard and simple are not opposites. Sometimes the simplest things are the hardest. Stand, wait, believe, love without demanding certainty, trust without requiring proof, simple words, a lifetime of practice to live them." Fatima turned back to the horizon. The red had faded. The purple was deepening into the first hints of night. The stars were beginning to appear, one by one, pinpricks of ancient light in the darkening sky. She said, "I love him. I have never said it. Not to him, not to anyone, but I love him, and I do not know if I will ever have the chance to tell him." Malhun put her hand on Fatima's shoulder. She said, "You will have the chance, I believe it, and when you have it, do not waste it. Do not play games. Do not hide behind armor. Tell him the truth. Let him see you as you are, not as you pretend to be. That is the only way to love fully, Fatima, without the armor, without the walls, vulnerable and terrified and completely open." Fatima said, "That sounds even harder than standing and waiting." Malhun said, "It is, but it is also the only thing worth doing. Everything else is just survival. Love, real love, the kind that reaches across the void between two souls and creates something that neither could create alone, that is living. That is what we are fighting for, not the land, not the power, not the empire, the ability to love and be loved in return." They stood in silence as the night settled over Bursa. The muezzins had finished their calls. The city was quieting. The refugees in their shelters were eating the bread that had been baked for them and wrapping themselves in the blankets that had been given to them and beginning the long, slow process of healing that would take months, perhaps years, perhaps forever. And somewhere in the west, beyond the horizon, the men they loved were doing whatever men do when they have been tested to the edge of breaking and have not broken. They were rebuilding bridges. They were tending wounds. They were burying dead comrades and speaking prayers over their grave. They were looking at the stars and thinking of the women they had left behind and wondering if they would ever see them again. The war was not over. The war was never over. But in the quiet moments between battles, in the stolen spaces where exhaustion gave way to reflection and reflection gave way to longing, the war receded and something else took its place. Something quieter, something more powerful, something that no sword could cut and no fire could burn and no army could destroy. Love, the oldest and most dangerous weapon of all. In Constantinople, the night was thick and warm and smelled of salt and decay. The great city sprawled along the shores of the Bosphorus like a sleeping giant, its domes and minarets and ancient walls catching the moonlight and throwing it back into the sea. Somewhere in the depths of the palace, emperors schemed and generals plotted, and the endless machinery of Byzantine politics ground on, producing nothing of value and consuming everything of worth. But Daphne was not in the palace. She was in a different part of the city, in a district where the streets were narrow and the buildings leaned against each other like drunken friends, where the people who lived were the ones who could not afford to live anywhere else, and the people who visited were the ones who did not want to be seen. She sat in a room lit by a single candle. The man across from her was old, older than he appeared, with a face that had been weathered by time and treachery into something that was almost, but not quite, human. His name was Theophilus, and he had served 3 emperors in various capacities, none of them official, all of them deniable. Theophilus said, in a voice like sand scraping across stone, "You ask for much, Daphne. You ask for resources, for connections, for access to people who do not wish to be accessed. And you offer in return what? A promise, a vision, a vengeance." Daphne said, "I offer opportunity. The Ottomans are weakened. Shahanshah's campaign has failed to destroy them, but it has damaged them. Their supply lines are strained, their forces are scattered. Their sultan is spending resources on refugees and rebuilding that he should be spending on defense. This is the moment to strike. This is the moment when a carefully placed blade can accomplish what 100,000 soldiers cannot." Theophilus studied her. His eyes, which had seen everything and forgotten nothing, moved across her face with the detached curiosity of a scholar examining a specimen. He said, "You speak of blades, of strikes, of moments, but you do not speak of armies. You do not speak of alliances. You do not speak of the great movements of nations. What exactly are you proposing?" Daphne leaned forward. The candlelight caught her face and made it something not quite beautiful, not quite ugly, something in between that was more compelling than either. She said, "I am proposing that armies and alliances are blunt instruments. They make noise, they require feeding. They can be seen coming from 100 miles away. What I am proposing is something different, something surgical, something that strikes at the heart of the Ottoman state and removes it before the body even knows it is wounded." Theophilus said, "You are proposing assassination." Daphne said, "I am proposing removal. Call it what you like. The effect is the same. Orhan Sahib dies, his generals scatter. His empire, which is held together by nothing but his will and his faith, falls apart. The pieces are picked up by whoever is strong enough to take them. Shahanshah takes the eastern territories. Byzantium takes the west. And in the chaos, in the vacuum of power, opportunities emerge for those who are clever enough to seize them." Theophilus was quiet for a long moment. The candle flickered. Somewhere outside, a dog barked. Then he said, "You have thought about this carefully." Daphne said, "I have thought about nothing else. For months, for years, since the day the Ottomans destroyed everything I loved. This is not a passing fancy, Theophilus. This is not a whim. This is the purpose of my existence. The only thing that keeps me breathing. The only thing that makes the pain of living worthwhile." Theophilus said, "Vengeance is a poor foundation for strategy. It clouds judgment. It makes the vengeful sloppy. It leads to mistakes that the clear-eyed would never make." Daphne smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. She said, "You speak as though I were driven by emotion. I am not. The vengeance I seek is not hot. It is cold. Cold as the bottom of the sea. Cold as the space between stars. I do not want Orhan Sahib to die screaming. I do not want to see the terror in his eyes. I want him to simply cease to exist. Quietly, efficiently, without drama, like a candle being snuffed. One moment there, the next moment gone." That is not the work of passion, Theophilus. That is the work of precision, and precision is what I offer. Theophilus looked at her for a long time. Then he made a decision. He reached into his robes and produced a small leather pouch. He placed it on the table between them. He said, "Contacts, names, locations, people who can get you close to the Ottoman court, people who can provide the tools you will need, people who, for the right price, will do things that no honorable person would contemplate." Daphne took the pouch. She did not open it. She simply held it, feeling the weight of it in her hand, the weight of possibility, the weight of the future that it represented. She said, "What do you want in return?" Theophilus said, "What I always want. Chaos. The Ottomans have been expanding for too long. Their success makes Byzantium look weak. Their existence is an insult to the memory of what we once were. If they fall, we rise. If their sultan dies, their expansion stops. That is enough for me." Daphne nodded. She stood. She tucked the pouch into her clothing. She said, "You will hear from me when it is done." Theophilus said, "I prefer not to hear from you at all. If you succeed, I will know. If you fail, I do not want to be connected to your failure." Daphne smiled again, that cold, precise smile that contained no warmth and no humor and no humanity. She said, "I will not fail." And she walked out of the room, out of the narrow street, out of the district of shadows and secrets, and into the night that covered Constantinople like a shroud. She walked with purpose, with direction, with the particular stride of a woman who knows exactly where she is going and what she will do when she gets there. The names in the pouch were her ladder. The contacts were her keys. The tools they would provide were her weapons. And somewhere at the top of the ladder, beyond the locked doors and the guarded walls and the endless obstacles that stood between her and her objective, was Orhan Sahib. She would reach him. She would remove him. And then, finally, the fire that had been burning in her since the day her world was destroyed would have something to consume besides herself. The news of Faladios's retreat reached Shahanshah 3 days after it happened. He received it in his war room, surrounded by maps and advisors and the various instruments of strategic planning, and his face did not change when the messenger delivered the report. His face never changed. It was one of his greatest strengths and one of his greatest weaknesses, this ability to maintain a mask of calm indifference regardless of what he was feeling beneath. He dismissed the messenger. He dismissed his advisors. He sat alone in the room, looking at the map that showed the positions of his forces and the forces of his enemies, and he thought. Karadera had been a gamble, a costly gamble. 2,000 men sacrificed to draw Turhan east to create an opening for Faladios in the west. The gamble had partially succeeded. Faladios had reached the supply route. Faladios had burned the bridge, but the bridge had been rebuilt. The supply route was open again. The damage was temporary, not permanent. The expense had been paid, but the return had been insufficient. Shahanshah was a man who dealt in calculation. He did not believe in luck, good or bad. He believed that outcomes were determined by inputs, that if you applied enough pressure at the right points, the structure would collapse, and that failure was always the result of insufficient pressure or improper placement. Where had he miscalculated? He had underestimated Turhan. That was one error. He had expected the narrows at Karadera to be defended, but he had not expected them to be held. He had expected his assault force to push through, to pin Turhan in place while Faladios operated freely in the west. Instead, Turhan had not merely held. He had counterattacked. He had broken the assault in detail. He had turned what should have been a costly delay into a decisive defeat. He had also underestimated the speed of Arhan's response. He had expected Arhan to focus on the eastern threat, to commit his reserves to Karadera, to leave the west exposed. Instead, Arhan had split his forces. He had sent Turhan east and moved west himself. He had arrived at Karyoglan before Faladios could take the crossing. He had held the bridge long enough for reinforcements to arrive. 2 errors, not catastrophic, but significant. The kind of errors that accumulate over time and turn advantages into disadvantages and winning positions into losing ones. Shahanshah stood. He walked to the window and looked out at the lands he controlled, the cities and villages and fields that produced the wealth and the soldiers that fueled his ambitions. He thought about the future. He thought about what came next. He could not defeat the Ottomans with direct assaults. That was now clear. Their commanders were too good. Their soldiers were too motivated. Their logistics were too robust. Every attack he launched would be met, countered, absorbed. He could bleed them, yes. He could weaken them, yes, but he could not break them, not this way. He needed a different approach, something indirect, something that struck at the foundation rather than the walls, something that used their strengths against them. And then slowly an idea began to form. Not a plan yet, not a strategy. Just an idea, a seed, a possibility that might, with careful cultivation, grow into something useful. The Ottomans were strong because they were unified. Arhan held his commanders together through personal loyalty, through shared faith, through the bonds forged in battle. If that unity could be broken, if suspicion could be planted, if men who trusted each other could be made to doubt, then the structure would weaken from within and no amount of external pressure would be needed. It would collapse under its own weight. Shahanshah thought about the men around Arhan. Turhan, Evanos, Altadin, Khalil, each one loyal, each one proven, each one presumably beyond suspicion. But suspicion is a curious thing. It does not require proof. It requires only suggestion, a whispered word in the right ear, a carefully placed piece of evidence, a false trail that leads nowhere but that raises questions that cannot be answered. Once suspicion takes root, it grows of its own accord. It feeds on itself. It transforms allies into strangers and brothers into enemies and loyalty into a trap. Shahanshah smiled. It was the first expression his face had shown since the messenger arrived. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a man who has just discovered a new weapon and is imagining all the ways he might use it. He would not attack the Ottomans. He would not send armies against their walls or raiders against their supply lines. He would send something far more dangerous. He would send doubt. And the doubt would do what armies could not. The doubt would tear them apart. Back at Karyoglan, the bridge reconstruction was complete and the immediate crisis had passed, but the army could not remain there indefinitely. Supplies were sufficient for now, but would not last. The men were rested as men who had fought a desperate battle and spent the following days in hard labor could be. The time had come to move. Arhan convened his commanders for a council of war. They gathered in a tent that had been erected near the rebuilt bridge, a space that was functional rather than comfortable, with a table in the center and maps spread across it, and lamps providing light that flickered and danced with every movement of air through the tent flaps. Present were Arhan himself, Altadin Saheb, Evanos, Nasser Celebi, Carlil, and a handful of other officers whose presence had been requested. Turhan was not there, still holding Kara Dera in the east, but his absence was felt as a presence, a reminder that the army was divided and would remain so until the strategic situation clarified. Orhan spoke first. He said the immediate threat has been addressed. Faladios has withdrawn, the bridge is rebuilt, the supply route is open. Turhan holds the eastern narrows. Our position is stable, but stable is not secure. Shahanshah will try again. He will not accept this defeat. He will probe for new weaknesses, and he will find them if we give him time. Our task now is to deny him that time. Altadin said, "What do you propose, my sultan?" Orhan said, "I propose that we shift from defense to offense, not immediately, not rashly, but deliberately. We have been reacting to Shahanshah's moves. It is time to make him react to ours." Carlil said, "Do we have the strength for offensive operations? Our forces are divided. Our supplies are limited. Our men, though rested, have been through much in recent days." Orhan said, "We do not have the strength for a decisive campaign, but we have the strength for targeted strikes, for raids into Shahanshah's territory that will force him to defend rather than attack, for the kind of pressure that makes an enemy doubt himself, that makes him hesitate, that makes him wonder if his next move might be walking into a trap." Evanos said, "Where will we strike?" Orhan pointed at the map. He indicated a region to the southeast, an area that lay between his territories and Shahanshah's, a borderland that had changed hands several times over the years, and that both sides considered strategically important. He said, "Here, the valleys of Karip. Shahanshah uses these as a staging ground for his operations against our eastern border. He has supply depots here. He has a small garrison. If we take Karip, we cut his supply lines to the east, we deny him his staging ground, and we force him to commit resources to retaking it or to accept its loss." Altadin studied the map. He said, "Karip is defensible. The valleys are narrow, with good positions for archers. If we take it with a strong enough force and fortify properly, holding it against counterattack would be feasible." Orhan said, "My thoughts exactly, but we cannot commit our full strength to Karip without leaving other positions vulnerable. Turhan must remain at Kara Dera until we are certain the eastern threat has passed. The garrison at Bursa must be maintained. The western outposts must be watched in case Faladios returns." He looked around the table at his commanders, at the men who had fought beside him and bled for the cause, and proven their loyalty 100 times over. He said, "Evanos, I want you to lead the Karip operation." Evanos looked up. His face showed surprise, quickly controlled. He said, "My sultan, I am honored, but I must ask, why me? Altadin is the more experienced commander. He knows the eastern territories better than I do. He would be the logical choice." Orhan said, "Altadin is needed here. His knowledge of the western approaches is too valuable to spare. And you Evanos have proven something in recent days that experience cannot teach and knowledge cannot replace. You have proven that you can hold a position against impossible odds. You have proven that you can inspire men to fight beyond their limits. You have proven that you keep your promises. Those are the qualities I need at Karip. Not because the operation will be easy, but because it will be hard, and hard operations require leaders who do not break." Evanos was quiet, then he said, "How many men?" Orhan said, 300. It is all I can spare. But 300 men who fight like you and your 30 fought at Karyoglan can accomplish things that 3,000 ordinary soldiers cannot." Evanos nodded slowly. He said, "When do I leave?" Orhan said, "Tomorrow, at first light. You will take the northern route through the mountains. It is longer but less likely to be watched. You will approach Karip from an unexpected direction. You will take the position before Shahanshah realizes you are coming, and you will hold it, Evanos. You will hold it until I can bring reinforcements. Can you do this?" Evanos looked at the map. He looked at the valleys of Karip, the narrow approaches, the defensible positions. He thought about 300 men against whatever force Shahanshah would send to retake a position he could not afford to lose. He thought about Fatima, about the words she had spoken, about the promise he had made to himself to survive, to return, to stand before her family and ask for her hand. He thought about all of it, and then he said, "I can do this." Orhan smiled. It was a rare expression on his face, a brief lifting of the weight that he carried always, a moment of something that was almost but not quite joy. He said, "I know you can. That is why I am sending you. Go, prepare your men, sleep tonight. You will need your strength for what is to come." Evanos saluted. He turned. He walked out of the tent and into the evening air, and the stars were beginning to appear overhead, and the river was murmuring its endless song, and somewhere in the west, beyond the horizon, the woman he loved was standing on the walls of Bursa, waiting for him to return. He would return. But first, he had a position to take, and a war to win, and a promise to keep. Always a promise to keep. The night before the departure for Carip was quiet. The men who had been selected for the operation spent the evening in preparation, checking weapons, packing supplies, writing letters to families that might never be read, performing the various rituals that soldiers perform before they march into uncertainty. Evanos moved among them. He spoke to each man individually, as he had spoken to his 30 at Carrioglin. He learned names. He heard stories. He looked into eyes and saw the fear and the hope and the determination that lived there, sometimes in equal measure, sometimes with one dominating the others. He found Selim bin Yusuf among the 300. The young soldier had been assigned to Evanos's command at Turhan's recommendation, a transfer that came with a note in Turhan's own hand. This one has proven himself. He deserves to fight beside men who will bring out his best. Take care of him, Evanos. He has the makings of something exceptional. Evanos read the note. He looked at Selim. The young man had changed since Kara Dera. The fear was still there because fear never truly leaves, but it was balanced now by something else, a confidence that had been earned rather than assumed, a knowledge of his own capabilities that came from having been tested and not found wanting. Evanos said, "Selim, how are you?" Selim said, "Ready, Commander, ready for whatever comes." Evanos said, "That is a large claim. Are you certain?" Selim thought about it, then he said, "No, I am not certain. I do not think anyone can be certain, but I am willing to face whatever comes, and I think perhaps that willingness is what readiness really means." Evanos smiled. He said, "You have learned something that many men never learn, Selim. Hold on to that, do not let it go, no matter what happens in the days ahead. Willingness is the foundation of everything. Without it, strength is useless. With it, even weakness can be overcome." He placed his hand on Selim's shoulder, the way Orhan had placed his hand on Evanos's shoulder, the way Turhan had acknowledged Evanos's worth with a nod, the way strength was passed from man to man through gestures that contained more than words ever could. He said, "Rest tonight, tomorrow we march." And Selim nodded, and Evanos moved on, and the night continued its slow progress toward the dawn that would bring the beginning of the next chapter. The departure at first light was a study in efficiency. 300 men, mounted, armed, provisioned, gathered at the edge of the camp, and formed a column that stretched back along the road like a snake preparing to strike. Orhan Saheb was there to see them off. He stood at the head of the column and looked at Evanos, and what passed between them was everything that had been said in the council tent, and everything that had not been said, the unspoken understanding between a sultan and the man he trusted with his most dangerous missions. Orhan said, "Go with Allah, Evanos, take Carip, hold it, and when this is over, come home. There are people waiting for you." Evanos said, "I will, my sultan, inshallah." Orhan stepped back, Evanos raised his hand, the column began to move. They rode north into the mountains, following paths that were more suitable for goats than horses, climbing ridges that strained the animals and tested the men, descending into valleys that were cold and damp, and filled with mist that clung to their cloaks like the fingers of ghosts. The journey took 4 days. 4 days of hard riding and careful navigation, of cold camps and minimal fires, of constant vigilance against scouts and patrols that might reveal their presence to Shahanshah's network of spies. They saw no one. The mountains were empty, or if they were not empty, whatever inhabited them chose not to reveal itself to 300 armed men moving with deadly purpose. On the 5th day, they reached the ridge above Carip. Evanos lay on his stomach at the edge of the ridgeline and looked down at the valley below. The position was exactly as the intelligence had described it. A small fortress, stone walls, wooden gates, a garrison that numbered perhaps 100 based on the activity visible within the walls. Supply depots ranged along the valley floor, carts and wagons and stockpiles covered with oiled canvas to protect them from the weather. Behind him, his 300 waited in the tree line, invisible from below, silent, disciplined, ready. He studied the approaches. The main gate faced south toward Shahanshah's territory. The walls were strongest on that side, built to defend against attacks from the direction most likely to produce them. But the north side, the side facing Evanos's position, was weaker. The walls were lower there, the defenses less elaborate. Shahanshah had not expected an attack from the mountains. He had considered the terrain too difficult, the approach too impractical. He had been wrong. Evanos slid back from the ridge and gathered his commanders. He laid out the plan in quiet, precise terms. They would attack at dawn the following day. The cavalry would circle around to the south and create a diversion at the main gate, drawing the garrison's attention in that direction. Meanwhile, the infantry would descend from the northern ridge and scale the walls using ropes and ladders that they had constructed during the journey. Once inside, they would open the gates from within, and the cavalry would flood through. It was a simple plan. Simple plans were the best plans, because complex plans had too many points of failure, too many opportunities for things to go wrong. Simple plans could be adapted. Complex plans shattered at the first unexpected variable. The commanders understood. They dispersed to brief their men. The night was spent in final preparations, in sharpening blades and checking ropes and whispering prayers in the darkness. And then the dawn came. The attack on Carip was over in 2 hours. The diversion at the south gate worked perfectly, drawing the garrison's attention, while Evanos and his infantry scaled the northern wall in near silence. The first the defenders knew of their presence was when Ottoman soldiers began appearing on the walkways above them, cutting down archers, seizing the gatehouse, throwing open the main gates to admit the cavalry that had been waiting just out of sight. The fighting was brief and brutal. The garrison, outnumbered and surprised, fought with the desperation of men who knew they were losing, but desperation is not strategy, and within 2 hours the fortress was in Ottoman hands. Evanos stood in the center of the courtyard and looked around at what they had taken. The walls were intact. The supply depots were theirs. The garrison had been eliminated, with some prisoners taken and the rest killed in the fighting. The position was strong, defensible, exactly the foothold that Orhan Sahib had wanted. He turned to his second in command. He said, "Begin fortification immediately. I want the northern wall strengthened to match the southern. I want observation posts on every high point within a mile. I want patrols sent out in every direction to identify any approaching enemy forces. Shahanshah will respond to this. He will send men to retake what we have taken. We must be ready when they come." The work began. 300 men transformed from an assault force into a garrison, trading swords for shovels, trading aggression for preparation. They dug trenches. They reinforced walls. They created kill zones and fallback positions, and all the various instruments of defense that would transform Carip from a prize worth taking into a trap waiting to close on anyone who tried. And while they worked, Evanos stood on the ramparts and looked south, toward the lands where Shahanshah ruled, and where the next threat would inevitably come from. He thought about Fatima. He thought about the promise he had made to himself. He thought about the long road that still lay between him and the future he wanted. He thought, "I will return." He thought, "I will hold this position." He thought, "I will keep my promises." And the sun climbed higher, and the work continued, and somewhere in the distant capital of Shahanshah's domain, messengers were arriving with news of what had happened, and the response was being planned, and the next chapter of the war was about to begin. But that chapter would wait for another day. For now, Carip was held. For now, the position was secure. For now, Evanos had done what he had promised to do. And the war continued. As it always does. As it always will. Until the last sword is sheathed, and the last prayer is spoken, and the last breath of the last soldier fades into the silence of a world that remembers everything and forgives nothing. The war continues. But so does hope. So does love. So does faith. And in the end, perhaps, those things matter more than all the battles, and all the strategies, and all the blood that has been spilled, and will be spilled in the endless, exhausting, necessary struggle to build something worth defending. Perhaps the stars knew. But the stars were not telling.